The First Samnite War, despite being the first war in a series of wars that would become some of the most important and well-known of the early Republic, is a bit of a historical question mark. The real issue is that the only continuous account we have is that of Livy's, which I've already discussed as being not exactly the most reliable of sources. Because of this, when we look at the war, we again have to engage in a bit of, shall we say, skeptical reading. So then what does Livy actually tell us? Is any of it believable? And was the First Samnite War actually real? Let's talk about it. In this episode, we'll be looking at the events leading up to the war, as well as the actual declaration of war itself. The next episode will be dealing with the actual fighting and the peace treaty. Tensions with the Samnites had already been steadily increasing during Rome's southward expansion. This boiled over in 354 BCE, when Rome finally came into contact with the Samnite border. Remember that at this point in history, borders were not exactly what we think of today. These borders would have been fairly flexible, and likely would have consisted of hundreds of acres of unused or sparsely populated land. The one real exception to this are natural borders. Natural borders, such as rivers, mountain ranges, and other natural features, presented a great opportunity for the creation of static, or at least semi-static, borders. This was the case with Rome and the Samnites. The border in this case was the Liris, now known as the Garigliano River. This 25-mile-long river not only represented the border between the political entities of Rome and the Samnites, but also the historical border between Latium and Campania. By the time of 354 BCE, the Romans and the Samnites needed to come to some sort of agreement to govern the rules and set formal boundaries around their shared border. This resulted in some sort of treaty. This treaty, mentioned by both Livy and Diodorus, does not survive into the modern day. And even Livy and Diodorus either didn't know what the terms of the treaties were, or were apparently uninterested in recording those same terms. Because of this, we are really left to guess at what this treaty could have been. We can probably safely assume that it formally established the Liris River as the border between Roman and Samnite influence, with the Romans retaining control over the area north of the river, and the Samnites over the area south of the river. But beyond that, we really have no clue. Could the treaty have contained a declaration of friendship between the two peoples? Sure. In fact, as we will later see, it seems as though Livy thought it certainly did. Could it have contained trade agreements of some sort? Once again, sure. However, we just simply do not know. In any case though, the treaty wouldn't stick around for too long. In 343 BCE, just 11 years after the signing of the aforementioned treaty, the Romans would receive word of the invasion of the Sidicini, a people of Campania, by the Samnites. The city of Teneum Sidicinium, modern-day Tieno, was apparently fairly wealthy at this point in history, and served as a vital center for trade not only up and down the Liris River, but apparently across the surrounding regions as well. We can assume that this declaration of war was done with some sort of prior notification, or the Sidicini were wise enough to realize that the gathering of Samnite troops on your border was probably not a good thing, as the Sidicini almost immediately requested the aid of the Campanians. The Campanians were another Italic group native to, you guessed it, Campania. They were likely in some way or another related to the Samnites, but had split from the group by the 340s BCE culturally. Campania had been a region of Italy where the Greek influence was felt the most, and because of this the Campanians adopted much of Greek culture, including Greek political systems, artwork, military ideas, and so on. Because of this, and despite their genetic relationship to the Samnites, the Campanians were easily convinced to help the Sidicini. The three sides fought a few battles, with the Samnites emerging victorious every time, and eventually the fighting made its way to the main city of the Campanians, Capua. Finally, at the brink of full-on defeat at the hands of the Samnites, the Campanians, the Sidicini are sort of forgotten at this point, turned to Rome for aid. Apparently, the Campanians sent a few ambassadors to the city of Rome itself, where they were welcomed before the Senate. In a speech before the Senate, the Campanians proposed an alliance between the Romans and themselves, apparently appealing to the fact that the famous Campanian wealth would greatly benefit Rome, and that the Campanians would be of great help in subduing the Volsci, another Italic enemy of Rome. I hear you asking, how can the Romans sign an alliance between the Campanians and themselves if the Campanians are at war with the Samnites, a group Rome had just signed a treaty with? Well, the Campanians either thought the same thing or were pressed by the Roman Senate, as they read that treaty out to the Senate and pointed out that nowhere in the Samnite treaty did it prohibit Rome from forming an alliance or creating a treaty with the Campanians. And to top it all off, the Campanians pointed out that if Rome did nothing to help them, then Campania would be conquered by the Samnites, and their wealth would be added to the Samnites rather than the Romans. Following this exchange, the ambassadors were excused while the Roman Senate debated the proposal. The Senate concluded that Campania would indeed be quite the catch to add to the growing Roman Republic. Not only would they receive the apparently famous Campanian wealth, but their land was also extremely fertile, and would serve as an excellent granary for the growing Roman population. However, the Senate decided that it was impossible for Rome to remain loyal to the already existing treaty to the Samnites, while also agreeing to the Campanian proposal. Because of this, the Senate decided to reject the proposal from the Campanian ambassadors. However, apparently the Campanians expected such a thing to occur, and following the rejection by the Senate, the Campanian ambassadors unconditionally surrendered the city of Capua, and by extension the people of Campania, to the Romans. Apparently, the Senate was so moved by this that they determined that Rome was now honor-bound to protect the newly added territory and people from the Samnite attacks. In furtherance of this newly determined plan, the Romans sent envoys out to the Samnites. These envoys informed the Samnite leaders of the new situation in Campania, and asked that in accordance with the treaty that was previously signed, the Samnites refrain from attacking the newly acquired Roman territory. However, the Samnites were not going to simply roll over and take this one lying down. Livy states that the Samnites reacted with defiance, saying, quote, "Not only did the Samnites declare their intention of waging war against Capua, but their magistrates left the council chamber and in tones loud enough for the envoys to hear, ordered their armies to march out at once into Campanian territory and ravage it." When news of such a response reached Rome, the Fetiles were sent to demand apologies and security guarantees. The Samnites, however, were unwilling to do so, and because of this, Rome then declared war. Well, that's a pretty good story, but the question is, did any of this actually happen? Was this Livy recording history, or Livy inventing some sort of story to make Rome out as an honorable protector who rushed to the defense of their new ally? Well, historians are generally fairly skeptical of the details of this account. Let's go through each section of events one by one and see what we can glean from this account. Firstly, we have the events preceding the involvement of Rome itself. There almost certainly was some sort of treaty between Rome and the Samnites. Now, we have next to no idea what all of the treaty contained. We assume that it likely set up some sort of boundary between the Romans and the Samnites at the river Liris, but other than that, we are essentially guessing. It seems as though Livy believed it contained some sort of promise or agreement on Roman and Samnite friendship, or at least some sort of cooperation. This is certainly possible. In fact, it wouldn't really be all that surprising if it did. Remember, this is only 40 or so years after the sack of Rome by the Gauls. Not only that, but Rome still had other enemies around them, and they were still technically in the midst of the conflict with the orders. The point here is that there is reason to believe that Rome may not have been looking to add another enemy to their already fairly exhaustive list. In any case, we can assume that there was something here that at least trended towards friendship, or at least an agreement to not be overtly hostile. Next, we move on to the war between the Sidicini and the Samnites. This is once again very believable. While Livy almost certainly simplified the war down, remember that Livy was concerned with the history of Rome and not some random Italic people, the general concept of the war is very possible, and in fact, probable. The Sidicini capital served as a rich and important crossroads of trade, something that any growing power would have loved to add to their realm. Further, we have no evidence of Rome being overtly concerned with the Sidicini nor their fate. Remember how I mentioned in the video that the Sidicini sort of disappear from the narrative as soon as the Campanians get involved? Yeah, that wasn't an accident. The Romans, and by extension Livy, really didn't care about the Sidicini. In fact, it seems as though it was only the involvement of the Campanians that interested Rome. So really, the Samnites had nothing to stop them from declaring a war against the Sidicini. So, we can say with some certainty that the events prior to the involvement of Rome are fairly believable, despite Livy probably leaving some details out. The general outline is probably accurate. Now we move to the most questionable part of the entire account, the Campanian embassy. This whole episode is, frankly, and pardon my language here, almost certainly bullshit. In fact, it seems as though our dear friend Livy engaged in a bit of plagiarism for his version of events. In Thucydides' famous History of the Peloponnesian War, he describes a speech before the Athenian assembly by a few ambassadors of the city of Corcyra. Corcyra had been dealing with a civil war in one of its colonies, Epidamus. Epidamus had erupted into a civil war and had come to its mother city, Corcyra, for help. Corcyra, though, was apparently uninterested and decided to stay neutral in the whole affair. Epidamus found this to be unacceptable, and in an attempt to save their city, and probably their grasp on power, the ruling class turned to Corinth. At this point in time, Corinth was an extremely powerful city-state of Greece, and an ally of the Spartans. Corinth was apparently willing and able to help, and sent a garrison to protect the city. This infuriated Corcyra, and a naval battle ensued in which Corcyra won. However, the issue was that Corcyra was now afraid that Corinth would be able to call in its powerful allies in the Peloponnesian League. If they did this, then Corcyra would be easily conquered, as it was a neutral city-state with no powerful allies. So Corcyra decided to send a few emissaries to Athens in the hope of securing an alliance and security guarantees against Sparta. Sound familiar? Well, it's about to get a whole lot more familiar. The emissaries presented 4 main points to the Athenian assembly. The first was that Athens would gain the respect of many city-states if it agreed to an alliance, because Athens would be seen as coming to the aid of a city-state in trouble. The second was that Corcyra would be indebted to Athens, and thus extremely loyal. The third was that the alliance would not break the 30 years peace treaty, since Corcyra was a neutral city-state, and thus had the right to join an alliance of its choice. And the fourth and final point was that war was inevitable between Athens and Sparta, and so Athens should do everything it could to increase its power and show its strength. Corcyra's navy, which was second in size only to that of Athens, would be a great asset in the hypothetical upcoming war. Now, all those points should sound vaguely familiar, but that second and third point, they should sound really familiar, as that is essentially word for word exactly what the Campanians said to the Roman Senate. Back in Greece, eventually the Athenians agreed to a defensive alliance, which eventually boiled over into the Peloponnesian War. The point here is that it seems fairly obvious that Livy essentially copied Thucydides. Further, to have Rome suddenly decide that morally they must decline the Campanian offer sounds a little bit too goody two-shoes, and is just the sort of thing that Livy and other contemporary Roman historians would have invented in the hopes of making Rome look like a morally correct and righteous state. Some historians have proposed that this is actually a retrojection, which is essentially an event overlaid into a different time period from when the event in question actually occurred. Essentially, the theory goes that Livy actually retrojected the events of the Second Punic War, where Capua famously sided with the Carthaginians, onto this period, with the goal of shifting some of the blame and motive from Rome onto the Campanians. Now, why would he do this? Well, think about what would actually be the case if we removed this story of the Campanians surrendering their people in their city. Rome would have almost certainly broken a treaty, a very dishonorable act against the Samnites. This is something that would go against every fiber of the idyllic Roman state, and this story of the surrender of the Campanians at least gives the Romans some sort of moral justification for their actions. However, other historians argue that such a series of events were actually entirely possible, and even possibly common during this period. We do know that oftentimes throughout Roman history, a state would come to Rome with the hope of securing their backing against another invading state. If Rome accepted, then the state in question would essentially be treated as a Roman client, or even just as another Roman province, as that was typically the price the state had to pay for Roman help. When we think about these other examples, then suddenly the surrender doesn't seem all that crazy. While the events stated by Livy are probably fake, the idea that the Campanians would have looked to Rome to save them from the Samnites is really not all that far-fetched. In my personal opinion, I imagine that Rome willingly broke the treaty signed with the Samnites in favor of protecting or absorbing the Campanians and their land into the growing republic. Or they may have even just saw an opportunity in the weakening of the Campanian state by the Samnites and felt that they had to get in on the action. In any case, Livy, probably knowingly, then wrote up this grand story to try and paint the Romans in a better light, and thus we are left with his account. But I would be interested to hear what you think down in the comments. And this is where we will leave our examination for now. Rome and the Samnites were now at war, and it wouldn't be too long before both sides clashed on the battlefield. What would happen in these clashes? Would the Romans easily defeat their enemy, or would they struggle? And what would happen at the end of this war? Join me next time as we answer these questions and more. The year is 343 BCE, and Rome was about to march to war. In the previous year, the Roman Senate had received a plea for assistance from the Campanians. The Campanians were at war with the Samnites, and were on the brink of complete and utter defeat. Rome had seemingly gone against their agreed-upon treaty with the Samnites in favor of protecting the Campanians. Rome had tried to simply scare the Samnites away with vague threats and appeals to the very same treaty that the Romans had decided to reject. The Samnites, though, were not going to back down so easily, and Rome had two options. They could either back down and allow the Samnites to conquer Capua, and by extension the Campanians, or they could march off to war. I'm sure I don't need to tell you which option the Romans chose. So, could they win this war? If they did win the war, what would they gain? If they lost, what would they lose? And was any of this even real? Let's talk about it. Livy tells us that both consuls for the year, Marcus Valerius Corvus and Aulus Cornelius Cossus, marched off to wage war against the Samnites. This tells us that the Samnites were considered the primary threat, and maybe even the only threat to the Roman state. For both consuls to be sent off to the same war signaled a degree of self-assuredness for the Romans. Remember that at this point in Roman history, it was the consuls who held the power of imperium in military matters. Technically, only the consuls could command Rome's military in anything but the most basic of maneuvers. So, to send both of these two men off to the same place was a sign that Rome was both serious about this war and confident in the safety of their own territory. Each consul was given his own army to command. Marcus Corvus led his army into Campania, while Aulus Cossus led his army into Samnium. Marcus Corvus marched his army to somewhere around Mount Garus, a volcanic mountain located near the city of Cumae, while Aulus Cossus led his army to the Samnite city of Satacula. We are not given an exact timeline, so we aren't sure how long it took, but it seems like fighting broke out fairly quickly. The first consul to engage the enemy was Marcus Corvus. We are told that right after instructing his army to encamp at the base of Mount Garus, the Samnites quickly showed up. The Samnites were already present in Campania. Remember, they had been close to taking the city of Capua, a city only a day's march away from Cumae. And secondly, they assumed that the main theater of the war would be in Campania. This really made a lot of sense if you consider the supposed reason for this war, Rome's defense of Campania. Naturally then, the Samnites would assume that most, if not all, of the fighting would take place in Campania. They would be proven wrong, but back to that in a moment. We are told that both sides briefly prodded each other with a few skirmishes, before eventually Marcus Corvus decided that Rome should strike first. Corvus ordered his men out of camp, and a battle quickly ensued. At first, the battle seemed completely even, with neither side being able to gain any sort of advantage. Seeing this, Marcus Corvus knew he needed to do something to change the tide of battle, or risk a stalemate, or even worse, a long protracted battle that would end with the Romans out of camp and the Samnites free to sally out. Marcus ordered his cavalry to directly charge at the Samnite line, hoping to poke a hole in the line through which his infantry could then charge through. This failed miserably, and the Roman cavalry was forced to retreat or face being pulled from their horses. Marcus, though, was unwilling to give in so easily. He dismounted and personally led an infantry charge against the Samnite line. This too was pushed back. The battle at this point had gone on for most of the day, and darkness was quickly approaching. This meant that one way or another, the battle was about to end. Nighttime fighting is almost never a good idea, and the Romans knew this. Livy tells us that the Romans, despite their tiredness and their disappointment over the failed attempts to break the Samnite line, came together for one last desperate attempt to break the line. This attack apparently worked, and the center portion of the Samnite line crumbled. The Romans poured through and would have slaughtered the Samnites if not for nightfall. The Romans reluctantly withdrew and allowed the battered Samnites a chance to regroup. However, come morning, the Romans would find that the Samnites had retreated rather than face them once again, and Rome had won the day. Livy tells us that sometime after the war, the Samnites were asked why they retreated, and responded with, quote, "The eyes of the Romans, which seemed to them to blaze, along with their furious expression and frenzied glare." It was said that after their glorious victory, the Campanians treated the Romans like conquering heroes and showered them in gifts and praise. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what exactly I think of this account. I mean, come on, the battle goes from a stalemate to a sudden rout, not because of any genius military maneuver, but because the Roman soldiers looked intimidating? Had they not looked intimidating for the whole fight? Did they bait the Samnites with caring looks before suddenly unleashing their rage in the last few moments of the battle? Something is smelling a bit fishy here, but let's take a look at the rest of the war before we get too deep into this. Now, shortly after, or perhaps even at around the same time, the other consul, Aulus Causus, led his army deeper into Samnium. Samnium was a very mountainous area, and most of the time the Roman army was forced to navigate through the few passes they knew of. This, of course, was great for the Samnites, who had intimate knowledge of their mountainous homeland. I mean, a large Roman army marching through a mountain pass where they knew next to nothing about the local terrain, surrounding passes, or little shortcuts through the mountainous terrain was probably the greatest dream of whatever Samnite commander was assigned to battle the Roman army in question. This was exactly what happened shortly after the Roman army left their encampment at Saticula. The Samnites had trailed the Roman army in their march and had occupied the highlands above a narrow valley that the Romans would be forced to march through. This was perfect ambush territory. The Romans were apparently ignorant of the threat and marched right into that narrow valley. Sometime during the ensuing fighting, a military tribune by the name of Publius Decius Mus noticed that one hill had been neglected by the Samnites and had been left completely unoccupied. Publius instantly informed the consul of the hill in question and was given approval to lead a detachment of Roman troops to claim the hill. Publius led these men up the hill and quickly captured the summit. The Samnites, who had failed to notice Publius until it was too late, panicked and turned their attention away from the main Roman force and towards Publius's men. This allowed Aulus Causus, the consul, and the majority of the Romans to withdraw to more favorable terrain and get out of the Samnite ambush. This of course left Publius and his men to their own devices. The Samnites quickly surrounded the hill and cut off any chance Publius had of escaping. But they didn't attack. Night had come before they had managed to assault the hill, and so the Samnite army settled down for the night, content to wait until the morning to retake the hill and turn their attention back to the main Roman force. Publius, though, was not content to wait the night out. We are told that Publius, along with a few of his centurions, scouted the Samnite positions where they noticed that only a light guard had been put in place. Publius quickly returned to the summit of the hill and informed the men that they would be attempting to break out during the cover of night, silently if they could, but by force if they must. Apparently, the Romans were able to sneak about half of their force through the Samnite defenses before they were discovered. Publius and his men quickly let out a fearsome battle shout, and in the ensuing chaos managed to get away from the hill and the Samnite camp. The next morning, Publius urged Aulus and the other Romans to quickly assault the Samnite positions, believing that the Samnite camp was disorganized and that the Samnites would be easily routed. Aulus apparently agreed and quickly ordered the army to prepare for battle. The ensuing battle was a complete Roman victory. The Samnites were taken completely unaware and quickly routed. Livy tells us that the 30,000 or so Samnites were slaughtered to a man. Following the battle, Publius and his men were honored by Aulus. Publius himself received a golden chaplet, 100 oxen, and a single white ox with gilded horns, while his men all received double rations, 1 ox, and 2 tunics. Publius sacrificed the white ox in the name of Mars and split the other 100 oxen up between his men. Publius was further granted 2 grass crowns, the highest honor for any individual military commander short of a triumph, for both his saving of the main Roman army during the ambush and his leadership during the Roman escape. Publius would actually go on to be a fairly important figure in Roman lore, and these events served as the foundation for his legend. Once again, I will hold off on giving my full comments on this battle until a little later in the video, but let's just say that I struggle to believe that not only did a large Roman force manage to sneak away from being fully surrounded, but that the same force then participated in an attack only a few hours later and killed 30,000 Samnites. Anyway, more on that in a bit. The next, and final battle, would occur at Susilla. The Samnites, reeling from 2 defeats, decided to combine all of their forces into one at the city of Susula in Campania. Marcus Corvus quickly received word of this gathering and force-marched his men to the city. This meant that the Romans were traveling very lightly. Their baggage train had been left behind. This allowed the Romans to set up a much smaller camp than normal. The Samnites quickly mustered their forces upon the arrival of the Romans and set out to give battle. The smaller camp was noticed by the Samnites, who believed that this meant that they were facing a smaller army, perhaps even only a forward scouting force. The common Samnite soldier wanted to assault the smaller Roman camp head-on, as they believed they had a massive numerical advantage. The generals, however, realized that something wasn't quite right and ordered the Samnite army to stand down for the moment. The Samnites, though, were running out of supplies, and so nearly as soon as the army had stopped, they were forced to send out foraging parties to try to increase their food supply. The Samnites believed this to be fairly safe, as they assumed the small Roman camp was likely also short on food and too numerically weak to sally out. They were quickly proven wrong. As soon as Marcus Corvus saw the Samnite foraging parties leave the camp, he ordered his full-sized Roman army to charge straight into the Samnite camp. The ensuing battle was a complete and utter Roman victory that even rounded up the Samnite foragers. The Samnites were once again ruthlessly slaughtered, and thus the Romans had their third victory in a row. This third victory apparently coincided with the end of the campaign season, and the consuls and their armies returned home. The two consuls were both given a triumph, and it seemed Rome had fully triumphed over the Samnites. The Carthaginians, yes, those Carthaginians, even sent Rome a 25-pound crown for the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in congratulations. However, this apparently wasn't the end of the war. The war would actually continue on paper for the next 2 years, until 341 BCE, but little to no fighting is recorded during these 2 years, and the two sides would eventually sign a peace treaty that was apparently very similar to the previous treaty, with the added acceptance of the Roman and Campanian alliance. Now we come to the slightly more boring, but just as important question of, was any of this real? Or did Livy just invent most of these events? Well, much like the events surrounding the beginning of the war, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There can of course be no doubt that some sort of fighting occurred. It is, after all, fairly hard to fight a war with no battles. In fact, it's even possible that only 3 battles occurred. After all, why would either side want to expend too many resources? The outline here is probably accurate once again. The real issue we have here are in the details. One of the most common themes in early Roman history is the missing nature of any actual primary sources. This is due to a variety of factors: the simple passing of time, various catastrophic events that destroyed records, the Gallic sack for example, and even some level of possible historical revisionism. For instance, why would the Romans want it known that they broke a treaty between themselves and the Samnites? That's exactly the sort of thing that you cover up. Anyway, the point here is that when Livy decided to write his histories, he didn't exactly have a trove of historical data to fall back on. Yes, he had some writings from various Republican Romans, and of course the various oral accounts, but he was missing the massive written records that would become fairly common in later Roman history. Instead of just being able to compile the various histories of Rome into one large compendium, Livy was forced to fill in the blanks. Because of this, we have to take many of his accounts with a grain of salt. For instance, Livy's story of Publius Decius Mus is almost a word-for-word copy of a Roman record of the First Punic War, where a centurion led 300 men to take a hill before the Carthaginians noticed, and saved the Roman army in question from almost certain annihilation. Livy's account here is full of these strangely similar accounts, and it really calls into question what exactly we can believe. On the other hand though, Livy writes about this war with an air of embarrassment. He seems to really be disappointed in the way that Rome came to be at war with the Samnites, and even how the Roman army conducted itself in some portions of the battles. This is something completely out of left field for any Roman historian of the period. One of the most common themes in Roman history, that is written by Romans, is the greatness of the Roman state. Nearly every single instance of the Roman state doing something morally or legally wrong is explained away with either historical or ahistorical events that justify whatever action the state took. So this has actually convinced many historians that the general outline of events, and maybe even the specifics, are actually true. Otherwise, why would Livy invent Roman history that he was so embarrassed by? Personally, I really believe here that the general outline of events is accurate. Rome was at war with the Samnites, there were battles, and eventually the Romans won. However, I have some serious trouble believing the details of the battles in question. I mean, come on, the Romans supposedly nearly wipe out the Samnites in the first battle of the war, but they are still able to regroup and nearly defeat the Romans 2 more times? And then the Samnites were just so intimidated by the Romans that they just fled during the first battle? In the second battle, the man who just so happens to lead the Romans to their victories is a man who would come to be celebrated as one of the most important Roman heroes in the history of the Republic, with even the Roman Emperor Augustus commending him some 300 years later. It just all seems a little too convenient and fantastic for me to fully believe. Add to this that no other account backs Livy's stories up, and I just can't fully bring myself to accept his account. However, once again, the general outline here does seem to be accurate. Rome would establish their control over Campania following this war, and how else would they do that except through war? All in all, this seems to me to be another case of an accurate outline with a bit of fabricated details to fill in the gaps of Livy's sources. Whatever the truth may be, by 341 BCE, the Romans and the Samnites had certainly made peace. Rome established their control over Campania, and now knew that they could defeat the Samnites. The question now was, would Rome and the Samnites remain committed to the renewed treaty of friendship, or would the two sides end up at war once again? Well, considering that this is only one of 3 Samnite Wars, I'm sure you can answer that question yourself. But what would the next war look like? Would Rome steamroll the Samnites, or would a great war of attrition occur? Join me next time to find out. The year is 328 BCE, and once again tension in central Italy is beginning to rise. The Samnites and the Romans were locked in a fierce battle for influence over the region, and so far it seemed as though the Romans were the clear favorites. They had just recently humiliated the Samnites in the First Samnite-Roman War during the years of 343, 342, and 341 BCE. With their victory, Rome had not only managed to push the border between the two polities further into what had been recognized Samnite territory, but they had also managed to gain the allegiance, or at least the cooperation, of the Campanians, a very rich people located in, you guessed it, Campania. In the intervening years, a period of about 13 years, the Romans and the Samnites had not directly challenged one another. Instead, they had been competing in an influence war. Rome would gain the allegiance or an alliance with the city-state here, while the Samnites would gain the same with the city-state over there. This game, though, was about to change, and with this change, a new war would break out that would decide who would lay claim to central Italy. What caused this change? Why did war break out? And who would ultimately be victorious? Let's talk about it. Now, I did get a little bit ahead of myself. To really examine this war, we actually need to start in the year 337 BCE, with the return of our old friends, the Sidicini. The Sidicini had been the people that the First Samnite War had originally started over, and they were back in the mix once again. This time, though, the Sidicini had declared war upon the Aurunci, another Italic group in Campania. The Romans felt the need to get involved on the side of the Aurunci, due to the fact that they had refused the demands of the Samnites to fight against Rome during the First Samnite War. At first, the war was really going against the Aurunci, and their capital city, Aruncia, was destroyed, and they were forced to flee to Susia Aruncia. Yeah, they weren't very creative. It was at this point that Rome finally entered the fray. In 335 BCE, one of the Roman consuls, we're unsure exactly who, captured the town of Clay, the capital city of the Aunci, an ally of the Sidicini. The Romans took this opportunity to set up their own colony in the city. The Romans then went from town to town in the territory of the Sidicini, destroying and looting. In Samnium, a growing faction within Samnite leadership pushed for the Samnites to declare war on the Romans now. However, it seems the war ended too quickly for the Samnites to really put anything on the stone. Over the next few years, an uneasy feeling of tension would spread across the area as each side, Roman and Samnite, competed for and secured the loyalty of various city-states and towns. However, this would all boil over in 328 BCE. The trouble really starts at a town in Campania called Fragile. Fragile had been founded sometime during the 4th century BCE and had originally been inhabited by the Ausians, before eventually passing into the hands of the Volsci. And at some point just before 330 BCE, the Samnites had sacked and destroyed the town, leaving behind little to no survivors. For 2 years, the site remained unoccupied, until in 328 BCE, the Romans set up a colony at the site of the former town. The Samnites were certainly not happy with this, but if this had been the only event to occur in 328, then the two sides likely wouldn't have gone to war. But around the same time as the establishment of the new colony, a city-state known as Palaeopolis began to feud with Rome. Palaeopolis, as the name kind of implies, is actually the old city of what would become Neapolis, or modern-day Naples. The city had been founded by the Mycenaeans sometime during the 2nd millennium BCE, and while the city came nowhere near to the level of prestige, power, or influence that Naples would eventually have, the city and its inhabitants were certainly no pushovers. We don't know exactly what happened, but Livy tells us that for some reason Palaeopolis' rulers ordered an attack or a series of attacks on Romans living in Campania. This was likely due to Rome's increasing power in the region. Rome demanded some form of redress, but Palaeopolis refused, and Rome quickly declared war shortly thereafterwards. In 327 BCE, 2 Roman armies marched from Rome for Campania. At their heads were the 2 consuls for the year, Quinticus Publius Philo and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus. Philo moved towards Palaeopolis and Naples, who it seemed had allied with Palaeopolis, while Lentulus stayed back further inland and monitored the movements of the Samnites. He did this because Roman scouts and spies had noticed that the Samnites were levying new troops, and a rumor in the Samnite political sphere was that this was actually a first step towards a widespread rebellion or uprising against Rome in Campania. Considering the circumstances, I'd say it was pretty reasonable for Lentulus to remain behind. These rumors eventually reached Rome, and they had further developed to include tales that the Samnites were actively fomenting rebellions in the towns of Provernium, Fundi, and Formi, 3 Volscian towns that had recently come under the influence of Rome. In response to these rumors, the Senate sent envoys to the Samnites, and basically told them to tell the Samnites to quit their shit. The Samnites played dumb, and denied that they were preparing for war. They further denied the rumors that they were fomenting any sort of rebellion anywhere, and refuted the claim that they had already sent troops to aid Palaeopolis in its struggle against Rome. They further complained of the Roman settlement at Frigile, and even, either directly or indirectly, pushed the Roman envoys to declare war in Campania. Philo, likely ignorant of the wider going-ons of the Roman and Samnite stare-down, moved to take the city of Palaeopolis. He recognized that he needed to divide the 2 towns if he was going to get anything done. Frankly though, this was a risky strategy. While physically positioning his army between the 2 towns would isolate them, it also ran the risk of exposing his army to a multi-pronged attack. Philo, though, felt the risk was worth it, and moved his army to a position between the 2 towns. Something very interesting happened here though, and we should take a quick moment to discuss it, as its impact will be felt in later Roman history. Technically, the 2 consuls were coming up on the end of their terms. The 2 should have returned to Rome, where they would oversee the election of new consuls, who would then be given the ability to command the armies. However, the Senate, likely recognizing that things were simply too tense right now to even consider a change in command, passed a resolution extending the military command of the 2 consuls, while their political powers expired and were handed over to new consuls. Philo and Lentulus were now titled proconsuls, and were given the same level of military command that a regular consul would receive until the campaigns were resolved. This is something that will occur several times in later Roman history, but as far as we know, this is the first recorded instance of such a thing occurring. This meant that Rome basically had 4 consuls in 326. Philo and Lentulus were military consuls, while Gaius Potelius Libo Volsus and Lucius Papyrus Cursor were the year's regular consuls. While not super important to our story for today, this was an important moment in Roman history, and the beginning of a practice that we would see several more times in Roman history. Anyway, back to the war. We are told that in 326 BCE, a group of leading men in Naples were apparently dissatisfied with the way that the quote, Samnite troops were acting in their city. Remember that on paper, the Samnites had not actually sent troops to the conflict, but in practice, this was a contingent of Samnite troops. The Romans knew it, the Neapolitans knew it, and even the Samnites knew it. Anyway, the leading men decided that they no longer wanted to take part in this war, and engineered some sort of plot, we have no idea exactly what this means, that allowed the Romans to take the city. The new leadership in Naples now called for a renewed treaty of friendship with Rome, and the city was no longer a threat to the Roman troops camped between them and Palaeopolis. Now, this seems to have pushed the Roman and Samnite tension over the edge, and war was officially declared. Rome, led by Lentulus, took the towns of Alife, Calife, and Rufurium in Samnium, and the Lucanians and the Apulians both allied with Rome against the Samnites. The Samnites got their own alliance with the Vestini, a group of peoples who lived on the Adriatic coast to the northeast of Samnium proper. In 325 BCE, the consul Decimus Junius Bruttius Scavia ravaged the territory of the Vestini, and took 2 towns, Contini and Singalia. This is where a man by the name of Lucius Papirius Cursor enters our story. If you were paying attention, I already mentioned his name a moment ago as one of the Romans elected consul for the year 326. However, at least in terms of Samnite War activity, he didn't really do a whole lot that year. Instead, his moment of glory for the war would come in the already mentioned 325. Now, we don't really know why. We are only given the vague excuse of illness, but the regular consul for the year, Lucius Furius Camillus, was unable to command any troops. Because of this inability, the consul and the Senate recognized that Rome needed someone to take his place and command the Second Army of the Republic. Enter Lucius Papirius Cursor. Cursor was appointed dictator. This is a little odd considering that the other consul, Decimus Junius Brutius Scavia, seemed to be doing just fine, but Livy still tells us that Lucius Cursor became dictator, so I guess we kind of just have to roll with that. Anyway, Lucius quickly assumed command in the army and appointed Quinticus Fabius Maximus Rullianus as his master of the horse. The two set off to Samnium and began their campaign. However, early on, Lucius discovered that the auspices had not been taken correctly and returned to Rome to rectify the issue. This left Rullianus as the commander of the Roman army. However, Lucius expressly forbade Rullianus from engaging the enemy. Rullianus, though, ignored the instructions and gave battle to a Samnite army at Invernium, where he quickly crushed the force. Rullianus quickly sent a letter to the Senate, telling of his victory, and supposedly even burnt the spoils of war in an effort to ensure that Lucius couldn't use any of them in a triumph. Which sounds like quite a bit of bad blood. But it only gets worse. You see, shortly after this victory, Lucius heard of the battle and was absolutely enraged. No one was supposed to go against the order of a dictator. His word was law, and to even question his word was a horrid crime in the eyes of Rome, much less willfully disobeying a direct order. Lucius rushed back to camp, where he immediately sentenced Rullianus to death. The army, the Senate, and even the tribune of the plebs begged Lucius to reconsider, but Lucius remained steadfast in his belief that Rullianus must be punished. In fact, it seems as though Lucius was actually quite pleased with the victory. After all, who wouldn't be? But Lucius firmly believed that allowing any sort of questioning of the dictator's authority ran the risk of devaluing the position, and allowing others to begin to question the ultimate authority of the position. The death order was only cancelled when both Rullianus and his father fell to their knees before Lucius and begged for forgiveness. This placated Lucius, and he allowed the incident to end. Now, to burst the bubble just a little bit, this story is a little questionable. First of all, why would a dictator be needed in the first place? There was another consul easily capable of leading a second army. Why would you usurp him when only one consul was apparently incapacitated? Secondly, this event bears a striking resemblance to the later events between the dictator Fabius Maximus, who's actually Rullianus' grandson, and his master of the horse, Marcus Messenius Rufus, in 217 BCE. So, was this just another invention by Livy? Well, possibly. Is it also possible that this story is true? Sure. We will never know for sure. Personally, I believe that there is a kernel of truth somewhere in the story. I believe that the two probably did quarrel, either over positioning or which battle to take, but that the details of the events are greatly exaggerated by Livy. But let me know what you think down below. The war continued on either way. At some point during 324 BCE, Lucius inflicted a grave defeat on the Samnites, and it did enough damage that the Samnites sued for peace. In a show of good faith, Lucius left the region while negotiations took place. However, the two sides couldn't come to an agreement on a permanent peace plan, and so a one-year truce was agreed to while the finer details of peace were worked out. Apparently, though, Lucius was not happy with such a thing, and began to instruct his army to prepare for war once again. The Samnites noticed this and quickly summoned their own armies, and hostilities broke out once again. At this point, there was also some trouble in Apula, as one of the groups in the region, the Diani, declared war upon Rome. We believe it was likely the Diani, as it is their land which was caught up in the war, but to be fair, we aren't really sure. And even if it was, the Diani were really just a collection of various independent city-states, so we aren't really sure who exactly became enemies of Rome. In any case, the consuls for the next year, 323, were sent to battle on two fronts. Gaius Sulpicius Longus went to Samnium, while Quinticus Aemilius Cutanius went to Apula. There were no large battles to speak of, but areas of both fronts were laid to waste, and the Romans pillaged much of the countryside. In 322, rumors were going around that the Samnites were looking to hire mercenaries from abroad. In response to these rumors, Aulus Cornelius Cossus Arvana was appointed dictator and instructed to deal with the Samnites before they were able to receive reinforcement from the mercenaries. Cossus marched straight to Samnium and set up camp somewhere in Samnite territory. The Samnites gave chase, and eventually Cossus was forced to confront the Samnite force. But battle did not happen immediately, as when they caught up to each other, nightfall was fast approaching. The two sides set up camp for the night, and it looked as though the next morning would be a bloodbath. However, Cossus, likely uncomfortable with his position, planned to sneak away during the night to more favorable terrain. This retreat was noticed by the Samnites, and before the retreat could fully finish, the Samnite cavalry began to engage the Romans. The Romans attempted to quickly put down defensive fortifications, but were unable to do so without being harassed by Samnite cavalry, and so Cossus instructed his entire force to prepare for battle. The two sides charged at each other, and the true battle commenced. The fighting was extremely close for a time, and neither side truly gained any sort of advantage. For 5 hours the battle raged on. Finally, the Samnites noticed that the Romans had left their baggage train undefended. A portion of the Samnite army broke off to loot the baggage train, but this left the main force slightly disorganized, while the detachment that went for the baggage train were now exposed to a cavalry charge, as their flanks were undefended. Cossus quickly noticed this, and he took advantage of the situation. He ordered his master of the horse, Marcus Fabius, to charge the Roman cavalry into the Samnite detachment that had gone for the baggage train. This was apparently a slaughter, and the Samnite detachment was quickly decimated. This had a serious effect on the morale of both sides. The Samnites felt demoralized as they saw their comrades be butchered, while the Romans were sent into a near frenzy with the successful charge. Marcus Fabius then wheeled around to the main Samnite force and charged once again. This, combined with the greatly increased Roman morale and decreased Samnite morale, quickly resulted in a rout, and the Romans won the day. Livy tells us that this defeat was so humiliating and costly for the Samnites that they offered Rome their surrender, but the Romans refused. This would turn out to be a mistake for the Republic. For now, it seemed the war was far from over. The Republic had so far been successful in basically every engagement, and it looked as though they would easily continue to roll over the Samnites. They were so confident of this fact that they ignored the aforementioned surrender. But this would prove to be a mistake. So what happened in the later stages of the war? Why was this a mistake? And what course would the war eventually take? Join me next time to find out. Where last we left off, Rome was standing triumphant over the Samnites. They had almost utterly destroyed the Samnite army, somewhere in Samnium itself. The defeat was so terrible for the Samnites that they had immediately offered their surrender. This seems like a no-brainer for the Romans. They had won their war. Why would they not accept such a surrender? Well, we don't know, but they didn't. I told you at the end of the last episode, which you should probably check out before watching this one, that the Romans would come to regret this decision. This would happen at a small area in the Italian countryside, known as the Caudine Forks. What happened at the Caudine Forks? Why would Rome come to regret their decision to reject a surrender? And why do I call this one of, if not the most embarrassing defeat the Republic would face? Let's talk about it. We pick back up in 321 BCE. Rome had just finished their consular elections for the year, and the two consuls, Titus Fraternius Calvinus and Spurius Postumius Albinus Caudinus, were sent into the fields of Campania to continue the war with the Samnites. The two made camp at a small town called Calatia, which was just about a day's distance away from Capua. Gaius Pontius, hard to tell if this is his actual name as it seems a little too Roman, commanded the Samnite army, and made his camp at the Caudine Forks. The Caudine Forks, now called the Valle Caudina, or Caudine Valley, is a valley located in Campania. The valley had been inhabited for centuries, even by 321 BCE, and served almost like a road for travelers, traders, and armies trying to go from one end of Campania to the other. Gaius knew this, and he used this reputation to his advantage. He knew that if he could somehow convince the Roman consuls that their armies were needed on the other side of Campania, or even somewhere else in Italy, there was a decent chance that they would march right through this valley. So Gaius ordered a decent number of his soldiers, we're told anywhere from 10 to 20, to dress up as shepherds and pretend, or maybe even actually graze flocks in the fields around the town of Caladia. These fake shepherds were able to quickly cause a rumor to spread throughout the town that the Samnites would be moving to attack the city of Lucretia in Apua. Lucretia happened to be a Roman ally, and eventually this rumor reached the Roman encampment. The consuls believed that they needed to march to the aid of the city. Not only was the city an ally, but if the Samnites were attacking the city, then it was extremely likely that it would be with their full strength. What use was sitting in a camp when the action was occurring on the other side of the peninsula? So the consuls ordered the army to march towards the city of Lucretia, and just as Gaius had hoped, the consuls decided to march through the Caudine Valley. To enter into the main valley, the Romans first had to pass through two defiles, essentially a narrow pass or gorge whereby the army could only march in a narrow column. These defiles gave the Samnites the perfect opportunity to trap the Romans. The Samnites allowed the Romans to march through the first one unhindered. However, when the Romans exited the first defile, they emerged into a small, narrow ravine. This ravine served as a passage between the first and the second defile. The Romans quickly made their way to the second defile, but found it barricaded. Instantly, the Romans knew something was wrong. This was a well-traveled road, and any natural barrier would likely have been reported and cleared by now. The consuls ordered the army to turn around and make haste back into the first defile. However, the Samnites got there first. You see, Gaius had split his force up. One half went to the second defile, where they set up the aforementioned barricade along with a strongly fortified camp, while the other half stayed hidden in the trees and wilderness along the first defile. And when the Romans had fully exited the area, they quickly went to work setting up their own camp, along with a totally new barricade at the exit of the first defile. This meant that the Romans were trapped. On two sides stood the imposing natural terrain, a rocky, mountainous, and completely inhospitable environment, while on their other two sides, a formidable army of Samnites were encamped in naturally defensible positions. The situation was hopeless, and the Romans knew it. The Samnites now held the Roman army at their mercy, and the Romans didn't really have the morale to put up much of a fight, and even if they did, what were they going to do? They couldn't get out of the ravine via the terrain. If they charged their full force at one of the defiles, then they risked being attacked from their rear as soon as the fighting at their front started, an almost certainly hopeless position. And if they split the army up with one half attacking one defile and the other attacking the other, then they were numerically outnumbered and fighting a force that had dug in defensive positions. Oh, and did I mention that there was barely enough materials to set up a camp, much less a fortified encampment, and that the food was running low? The Romans were screwed, and they knew it. The ball was in the Samnite court, and it was up to Gaius to decide what to do. Gaius was hesitant to do anything. This was such a pivotal moment that if he made the wrong decision, not only could it risk the current war, but it could risk the Samnite state itself. Think about it. The Romans had been stomping the Samnites so far. Basically every battle was won by the Romans. It had been so bad that the Samnites offered to fully surrender to the Roman side. But the Romans were so successful that it blinded them, and they decided to carry on. For all Gaius knew, their ultimate goal was to march right into Samnium, take Bovinium, and subjugate the Samnites. But Gaius had managed to turn it all around. At his mercy were the vast majority of Rome's fighting men, 2 consuls, and most, if not all, of Rome's senior military figures. Forget the war, this could end the Roman threat to the Samnites for a generation or more. So Gaius did the thing that I think a lot of people would do when faced with such an important dilemma. He wrote to his father. His father, a man named Herennius Pontius, was a retired Samnite statesman, who, while never being the head honcho, so to speak, had still been a respected member of the Samnite government. Herennius wrote back quickly, saying that the Romans should be sent on their way, completely unharmed. Gaius rejected this advice. Why should an enemy army be granted complete clemency? They had just been slaughtering Samnites, and now Gaius just let them go? That just wouldn't do. Gaius sent a return message, asking him once again, what should I do? Herennius wrote back that he should slaughter the army, every single Roman should be put to the sword, and all of their belongings and supplies should be taken as tribute. Okay, what the hell just happened? Herennius goes from saying you should let them go to kill every single one of them and then loot their corpses? Well, Gaius was just as confused as the rest of us, so he summoned his father to the Forks to speak in person. Herennius made his way to the valley with all haste, and was quickly ushered into the Samnite camp to speak with his son. where I assume Gaius said something along the lines of "what the hell." Herennius repeated his advice, but he elaborated this time. If Gaius let the army leave unhindered, he would likely secure Roman friendship for a generation or more. Not only would the consuls be grateful for being spared, but so would the average soldier, and so would the families of those soldiers back in Rome. If Gaius killed the army to a man, then he would cripple the Roman war machine for a generation to come. Most of Rome's fighting men would be dead, their senior military figures would also be dead, and Rome's war machine would be completely and utterly crippled. In fact, there would have been a pretty good chance that someone like the Etruscans or the Gauls would have come in from the north and at least regained some of the losses they had suffered in the past few decades/centuries. This would have put Rome back quite a few steps in their empire building project, and may have even completely ruined the state. Suddenly, Herennius' advice makes a lot more sense. Gaius stood at a crossroads. He could either secure Rome's friendship and hope that that was enough to save the Samnite state, or he could cripple the Roman war machine and hope that it was enough to stunt or even reverse Rome's rise. Gaius, though, was apparently aghast at these options. They seemed extreme, and to be honest, he was right. These options were extreme, but war sometimes requires extreme choices. Herennius knew this, but apparently Gaius did not. Gaius asked about a middle path of letting the army go but imposing terms of defeat on Rome, and Herennius replied with a great line, saying this, quote, "That is just the policy which neither procures friends nor rids us of enemies. Once let men, whom you have exasperated by ignominious treatment, live, and you will find out your mistake. The Romans are a nation who know not how to remain quiet under defeat. Whatever disgrace this present extremity burns into their souls will rankle there forever, and will allow them no rest, till they have made you pay for it many times over." Well, Gaius ignored his dad. Seems a bit odd considering Gaius asked him for advice, but oh well. Gaius decided that he would demand the Romans surrender, and that they, quote, "evacuate the Samnite territory and withdraw their colonies." Well, that doesn't sound too bad, but just wait a moment. The consuls, though, had no choice. It was either agree to these terms or die fighting a battle they simply could not win. The few attempts they had made to break out had been completely unsuccessful, and their food supply was dwindling quickly. The Romans surrendered, and exited their hastily made camp completely unarmed. Gaius, though, was not quite done. Apparently he decided to completely ignore his father's advice, and give a little bit more humiliation to the Romans. He ordered a yoke to be constructed. A yoke, at least literally, is a wooden beam typically placed across the shoulders of various beasts of burden that enables them to pull the load together. This essentially makes the animals work as a group instead of alone, and allows them to pull much heavier loads. Symbolically, though, the yoke had, and still does, represent subservience, which makes a lot of sense when you consider the actual purpose of a real yoke. It was actually surprisingly common for the Romans and the Samnites to force prisoners to walk under a yoke before they were released, as a sort of ritual of subservience and as proof that the other side had triumphed. So with all of this in mind, the Samnites constructed a yoke made of 2 spears shoved into the ground and a third tied across. The third spear was just low enough that the Romans had to bend their head down to comfortably clear it. Already, this was extremely humiliating. But to add insult to injury, the entirety of the Samnite force stood in 2 columns on either side of the yoke, and as the Romans walked forward to face their turn, the Samnites hurled jeers and taunts, and had their swords pointed directly at the Romans. Livy tells us that some Romans were so indignant at their treatment that some Samnite soldiers took offense and killed them where they stood. When the Roman army had finally made their way past their humiliation, they were not quite sure what to do. Yes, they could make it back to Capua before nightfall. Capua was a city allied to the Romans, and a city that should have offered the army whatever they needed. But Livy tells us that the army was so ashamed and fearful of how their allies in Rome itself would respond to the punishment they had just suffered, that they kind of just stood there. The army basically just sat on both sides of the road. Despair and hopelessness overcame everyone, from the lowest legionnaire all the way up to the 2 consuls. Eventually, Capua received word of the army and their humiliating defeat. The Capuans, though, were far more forgiving and accepting than the Romans thought they would be, and they held nothing against the defeated army. In fact, they rushed to supply the troops with their own stockpiled weapons and armor, and gave the 2 consuls the city's own insignia of office, along with properly equipping the lictors with new fasces. Yet, even as the city and the Senate of Capua welcomed them with open arms, the Romans couldn't quite bring themselves to look the Capuans in the eye. so deep and painful were the feelings of despair and defeat. A few young noblemen from Capua would be tasked with escorting the army to the frontier with the Romans, and yet, as the army marched, they were completely silent. No salutations were returned, nor were any salutes, and even the Roman heads seemed to still be bowed, as though they were still walking under the yoke. Livy leaves us with a beautiful quote that captures what the Romans were feeling. The Samnites had won, not only a glorious victory, but a lasting one. They had not only captured Rome as the Gauls had done before them, but what was still a more warlike exploit, they had captured the Roman courage and hardihood. However, not all was lost. As Ulfilas Calavus, a Campanian noble, told the Capuan Senate, quote, "The truth is far otherwise. That stubborn silence, those eyes fixed on the ground, those ears deaf to all consolation, that shame, faced shrinking from the light, are all indications of a terrible resentment fermenting in their hearts, which will break out in vengeance. Either I know nothing of the Roman character, or that silence will soon call forth amongst the Samnites cries of distress and groans of anguish. The memory of the capitulation of Cadium will be much more bitter to the Samnites than to the Romans. Whenever and wherever they meet, each side will be animated by its own courage, and the Samnites will not find the caudine forks everywhere." Back in Rome, though, the news was just starting to sink in. At first, the city had begun to raise as many troops as they could, with the hope of rushing to the aid of the entrapped army. However, before the army could even be fully organized, news reached the capital of the horrible fate the Roman army had been forced to undergo. The Romans were in shock. How could their army, the army of the Republic, have done something so horrid? Why had they not fought to the last man instead of allowing such a humiliating action to befall the Republic? Didn't they understand that their actions and humiliation reflected not only on their army, but the country and the people as a whole? That shock quickly turned to anger. Rome went into mourning. The booths around the forum were shut up. All public business in the forum ceased. The senators laid aside their purple-striped tunics and gold rings. The gloom amongst the citizens was almost greater than that in the army. And yet, underneath it all, feelings of resent and hatefulness thrived. Everyone in the army, from the consuls to the officers, and even to the common soldier, were resented. There was even talk of not allowing them to return into the borders of the city. This changed, though, when the army itself arrived. Livy tells us that the army arrived looking not as a group returning to the safety of their city, but as prisoners. Every single man refused to look anyone in the eye. No salutes were given, no rituals or common practices were observed. Instead, the men marched straight to their homes, where they shut their doors and remained there for days, almost as though they were living in a sort of exile. Even the consuls refused to undertake any of the public duties they were responsible for. Eventually, though, the time for elections came about, and the consuls were forced to break their silence. Together, they nominated Publius Aelius Paetus and Quintus Fabius Ambustus to oversee the elections. However, the Romans were unable to hold elections for the year, as the people simply refused to vote. Such was their dissatisfaction with the consuls and the conduct of the army. Because of this, an interregnum was declared, and for a year or so, the Roman government was essentially in limbo. Eventually, Quintus Publius Philo and Lucius Papirius Cursor were both elected consuls. Those names probably sound extremely familiar, and they should. If they don't, maybe go back and check out part 1. Both men had already taken part in the ongoing Samnite War, and both were highly respected generals. I'm sure the Romans likely hoped that the election of the two men who had already succeeded against the Samnites would push hostilities to resume, and the Romans might regain some portion of their lost prestige. But first, the issue of what had just happened had to be brought before the Senate, and the two former consuls needed to explain themselves. Spurius Postumus was the first to speak, and this is what he had to say. Quote, "Consuls, I am quite aware that I have been called upon to speak first, not because I am foremost in honor, but because I am foremost in disgrace, and hold the position not of a senator, but of a man on his trial, who has to meet the charge not only of an unsuccessful war, but also of an ignominious peace. Since, however, you have not introduced the question of our guilt or punishment, I shall not enter upon a defense, which, in the presence of men not unacquainted with the mutability of human fortunes, would not be a very difficult one to undertake. I will state in a few words what I think about the question before us, and you will be able to judge from what I say whether it was myself or your legions that I spared when I pledged myself to the convention, however shameful or however necessary it was. This convention, however, was not made by the order of the Roman people, and therefore the Roman people are not bound by it, nor is anything due to the Samnites under its terms beyond our own persons. Let us be surrendered by the Fetiles, stripped and bound. Let us release the people from their religious obligations, if we have evolved them in any, so that without infringing any law, human or divine, we may resume a war which will be justified by the law of nations and sanctioned by the gods. I advise that in the meantime, the consuls enroll and equip an army and lead it forth to war, but that they do not cross the hostile frontier until all our obligations under the terms of surrender have been discharged. And you, immortal gods, I pray and beseech that as it was not your will that the consuls, Postumius and Venturus, should wage a successful war against the Samnites, you may at least deem it enough to have witnessed us sent under the yoke and compelled to submit to a shameful convention, enough to witness us surrendered, naked and in chains, to the enemy, taking upon our heads the whole weight of his anger and vengeance. May it be, in accordance with your will, that the legions of Rome, under fresh consuls, should wage war against the Samnites in the same way in which all wars were waged before we were consuls. God, I really do love reading that. I honestly recommend you all go read all of the speeches from Spurius Postumus in Livy's Ab Urbi Condata, as they are frankly incredible. The speech was so rousing and so inspiring that it set the Senate into a frenzy, and they were baying for Samnite blood. The tribune of the plebs, though, pointed out that as much as the Romans wanted to fight the Samnites, they had technically signed a peace treaty with the Samnites, a treaty that was agreed upon with an oath to the gods to uphold its terms. To go against the peace the treaty instituted would be to spit in the face of the gods. Did Rome really want to risk such an action? This caused the Senate to pause. To anger the gods was foolish, and they knew it. Spurius Postumus pointed out, however, that the treaty had actually been signed by the consuls and the senior military officials of the army, as they had refused to agree to a traditional treaty. A traditional treaty for the Romans involved the auspices being taken and the presence of the Fetiles, priests of Jupiter that served as a liaison between the gods and Rome in diplomatic matters. Essentially, Spurius said that the treaty bound himself, his fellow consul, and the other signatories, not the Roman people, nor the Senate. Because of this, Rome itself would be free to continue to war, just without those who had signed the treaty. In further penance for his actions, Spurius declared that he, along with Titus Calvanus, the other consul, would join the group of hostages sent to the Samnites. These hostages were meant to serve as guarantees for the treaty and ensure that Rome did not resume hostilities. Spurius, along with an undetermined and undisclosed amount of people, left Rome, along with the Fetiles, to journey to the Samnites and be formally handed over. We don't really know who all exactly was in the group, but we do know that Spurius and everyone who had signed the treaty were certainly there. In any case, the Fetiles brought the group before Gaius Pontius, where the Fetiles said, quote, "For as much as these men have, without being ordered thereto by the Roman people, given their promise and oath that a treaty shall be concluded, and have thereby been guilty of high crime and misdemeanor, I do, herewith, make surrender to you of these men, to the end that the Roman people may be absolved from the guilt of a heinous and detestable act." Just as he finished his words, Spurius struck the Fetile in the knee, and loudly proclaimed himself to be a Samnite citizen, which technically he would have been, as he had just been handed over as a hostage. A hostage was supposed to enjoy all the rights and privileges of a Samnite citizen, minus, of course, free movement. This was completely against the diplomatic rules of both the Samnites and the Romans. Fetiles were considered sacrosanct, and no harm was to come to them in their missions. Gaius Pontius denounced the Roman scheme, and declared that the Romans had not surrendered their hostages, and so the treaty was null and void. Gaius actually goes on a great rant here, but it's way too long for me to read in its entirety. I'll leave a link to an online resource where you can find the whole speech in the description. I really recommend you read it. In any case, the treaty was now voided on both sides, and war was free to resume. Now, it's pretty hard to say how much of this story is historically accurate. Most modern historians cast quite a bit of doubt on the authenticity of Livy's writings here. But there is no doubt that there was a truce during the period, 321 to about 319 or 316 BCE, depending on what exactly you consider a truce. There was no record of fighting in any of the sources, and it truly seems like the Romans and the Samnites did not fight during this period, or if they did, no record survives to our time. But the events here are a little hard to believe. This time, our main question mark comes in the form of geography. The defiles in question are nowhere near as narrow as Livy makes them out to be. The western one, the one that the Romans entered, is about 1 kilometer or a little over half a freedom unit wide. Certainly not large, but also not small enough that an army would have struggled to pass through, and certainly large enough that it would have taken a considerable amount of time for the Samnites to have barricaded well enough to hold the Romans in. The distance from this western defile to the eastern one is only about 4.5 kilometers, or just under 3 miles, which probably would have taken the Roman army about 1.5 hours to cross one way, and then another 1.5 hours to cross back. So if we are generous, and say it took 2 hours both ways, then that gives the Samnites 4 hours to completely barricade 1 kilometer. Not impossible, but definitely difficult. I also find it rather difficult to believe that Gaius Pontius simply ignored his father's advice. He had written to his father twice, and then even asked him to come out to the camp and advise him in person, and he just decided to ignore him? And what's more, he decided to do the one thing his father said not to do, humiliate the Romans. I personally believe that, as is always the case with Livy, there is a kernel of truth and accurate history here. I do believe that the Samnites succeeded in some sense during the war, and that they were able to achieve a period of peace. That may have even involved humiliating the Romans in some fashion. I think the real issue here is with the geography. This is a picture of the defiles. Look at that. Do you really think the Romans couldn't have broken out of that? I firmly believe they could have. I think that there was almost certainly a battle here, and I think it almost certainly went bad for the Romans. So bad that it humiliated those that survived, and even the whole of the Roman state for a time. But I think Livy was forced to once again, shall we say, interpret some historical details. Remember, Livy was not a historian. I know that there are a few of you getting ready to go down to the comments and disagree, and look, that's completely fine, but go and really read Livy's work. Read how he describes the great Roman character, and how Rome was destined to be this great empire that would change the world, and come back and tell me it doesn't at least vaguely sound like Roman propaganda. This is not to say that we should simply discount Livy and all of his writings, or ignore everything the man had to say. Instead, we must read Livy with an extra set of eyes. We have to brush through his work with a fine-tooth comb, and try to read in between the lines. Livy was not just writing so that I can sit here and talk about his history some 2,000 years later. Livy was also writing to ingrain in Rome certain values, and to further the Roman identity. This story is not just history, or at least history as Livy sees it, it's also a story of moderation, and a lesson in revenge. Gaius Pontius had the chance to either gain Rome's friendship, or to destroy the city's ability to wage war for a generation or more. While yes, those options are extreme. In war, extreme decisions must be made. Instead, Gaius chose a middle path, a path that would eventually spell defeat for the Samnites, and result in Rome back on top. This is a lesson that sometimes in life, the only options are the extreme ones. The path of moderation is typically good, but sometimes it is the worst option. Further, Livy instills a sort of Roman spirit to rise back up from the beaten mess they found themselves in. The Romans pulled themselves back into a position of power after humiliating defeat, something that the Romans prided themselves on, and something that Livy, and those who sponsored him, were keen to reinforce. To be fair to the other side, I could be talking nonsense here. Livy could be completely right. The battle, or I guess really political agreement of the Caudine Forks could be historically accurate. But, frankly, we will never know for sure. But let me know what you think in the comments. Was Livy completely accurate? Did he make some creative liberties? Or is he just completely making everything up? In any case, we are now in the year 319 BCE, and the war is about to get going again. Rome had come to regret their decision to ignore the Samnite offer of surrender, and were now, one way or another, humiliated. And yet, they were still kicking, something the Samnites were about to get a reminder of. Join me next time, as we finally wrap up the Second Samnite War. Rome was reeling. It had just suffered what was quite possibly the worst defeat in its history at the Caudine Forks. and it seemed as though the Samnites were about to triumph over their age-old enemy. And yet, Rome was not quite finished. Spurius Postumus, the consul who had signed the humiliating treaty at the Caudine Forks, had relit a fire under the Senate and the people of Rome with his speech before the new consuls. He had pointed out that the people in the Senate of Rome were not party to his treaty. Instead, himself and the other signatories were the only people who had to suffer the indignity the treaty prescribed. With his sacrifice, he pushed Rome back into its warring spirit. But the pains of humiliation were not quite over just yet. What else would Rome endure? Could they overcome it, or would the Samnites finally triumph over the Roman menace? Let's talk about it. We actually pick back up in 321, the same year that the humiliation at the Caudine Forks occurred. While Rome reeled in the aftermath, the Samnites were busy making moves. First of all, Satricum, a town in Latium, had defected over to the Samnite side. It's not quite clear if this move was solely undertaken by Satricum and its leaders, or if the Samnites had some sort of influence on the move. Another city, Fragile, where this war had really started, was also taken in a nighttime raid by the Samnites, likely helped by the men from Satricum. Finally though, in 320 BCE, the consuls and their armies were now ready to march into war. Lucius Papyrus took his army deep into Apula, while Quintus Philo stayed in Samnium to counter the Samnite presence in the region. Lucius moved his army to the city of Lucera, the town where the Roman hostages were being held. At first, neither side made many moves. The two Roman armies had essentially split the main Samnite force. The Samnites couldn't march to Lucera, as that would expose them to an attack from the rear by Philo. But if they attacked Philo, they risked either being attacked by Lucius Papyrus, or simply giving up Lucera and with it the Roman hostages. The hostages, while certainly not a material goal of the Roman army, did present an incredible opportunity to improve Roman morale. So the Samnites were in a bit of a bind. But of the two options, the choice was fairly clear. They had to attack Philo. We are told that this battle was an absolute bloodbath. The Romans were in such a frenzy that the commanders barely even had a chance to engage in any actual tactics. Instead, the bitter feelings of humiliation pushed the Romans into a mindless frenzy, and bands of Roman soldiers ripped into the Samnite lines, slaughtering indiscriminately. The Samnites were routed, and the Romans were so brutal that even the plunder carried by the Samnites was destroyed in their overzealous attempt to redeem their country's honor. Meanwhile, back with Lucius Papyrus, the situation was not quite as successful. Lucius had managed to make it to the city of Arpi, the whole time being harassed and followed by a sizable Samnite contingent. Here, a stroke of luck saved Lucius. Apparently, the locals were a bit fed up with the Samnites. Despite technically being allies, the people of this area had been harassed and raided by small parties of Samnites for centuries, and that mutual hate is hard to get rid of. Because of this, the locals gleefully offered to supply the Romans, and this food proved to be invaluable for the Roman army, and was frankly the only reason they were able to survive in the Apulan countryside. This stalemate changed with the arrival of the newly victorious Philo. Philo was now able to turn his attention to attacking and stopping the various baggage trains that were bringing the Samnites their supply from Samnium proper. With the supply line cut off, the Samnites were forced to give battle to the Romans, or face starvation. While the two sides prepared for battle, a group of emissaries from the city of Tarentum appeared in the two camps. The group ordered the two sides to cease their fighting, and promised that whichever side stood in the way of this ceasefire would be considered an enemy of Tarentum, and dealt with accordingly. At first, the consuls humored the request, and seemed to play along. However, when the auspices were taken, they showed favorable omens for battle, and that was that. With approval from the gods, the Romans were going to battle. The Romans quickly forced their way into the Samnite camp, and we are told by Livy that had the consuls not called the Roman men back, that each and every Samnite would have been slaughtered. Following this victory, the city of Lucretia was taken, and the hostages released. The remaining Samnite soldiers were forced to walk under the yoke, and for now, Rome's desire for revenge was sated. The war, though, was not yet over, but there would be a short truce. The Samnites sent envoys to Rome in 318 with the hope of securing the so far elusive peace treaty. Of course, and big shock here, the Romans refused, but a 2-year truce was agreed upon. In the meantime, the cities of Tinium and Cassanium in Apula submitted to the Romans, and the city of Fermentium and Satricum were brought back into the Roman fold as well. In 316, the war began anew. This time, we are told that the Romans had appointed a dictator to carry out the war. This dictator was Lucius Aemilius. Lucius Aemilius was a fairly respected Roman statesman, who had already served as consul and dictator, and probably seemed like a decent choice to ensure that Rome would be able to overcome the Samnites. He didn't disappoint. Lucius besieged the town of Satricola, a Samnite city that was right on the border between Campania and Samnium. The Samnites quickly responded, and set up their camp near the Roman encampment. We aren't quite told what the general setup here was, just that the Roman and Samnite camp were close to each other. But we know that the Samnites and the Saticolans were able to coordinate a dangerous double attack. The Saticolans suddenly, and with no warning, flung their gates open and charged the Roman positions closest to them. At the same time, the Samnites emptied their camp and attacked the portion of the Roman camp closest to them. We are told that both the Samnite and the Saticolan armies only just equaled the force that Rome had brought to prosecute the war. Because of this, and the fact that Rome was famously great at building stout fortifications, Lucius was able to leave a small force on the side of the camp the Samnites were attempting to break through, while he led the bulk of the force against the Saticolans. This proved successful, and Lucius was able to force the Saticolans to retreat back into their city. Leaving a force large enough to hold the Saticolans, Lucius turned his attention back to the Samnites. We are told that this battle raged much longer, and the fighting was slow and fierce. Eventually, the Samnites were forced to retreat back into their camp, but the fall of night forced the Romans to pull back, and the Samnites were given the opportunity to leave, an opportunity they took. In retaliation, the Samnite force besieged, and seemingly conquered, the city of Philistica, a Roman ally. By 315, Lucius Aemilius' term as dictator was over, and the Romans turned to our favorite rule breaker, Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus, to try and close the war out. Remember him? No? Well, he was the guy who was appointed as Lucius Papyrus' master of the horse, and the guy who disobeyed a direct order from Lucius Papyrus to not engage the enemy, and despite winning that engagement, was nearly executed for his defiance. Now, the apprentice had become the master, or I guess the master had become the dictator? I don't know, I'm still workshopping that one. In any case, Quintus marched down to Saticola to take over the situation, and bring the Roman army some much needed reinforcements. The Samnites had also brought reinforcements, and had set up a camp in a similar manner to last year's engagement, and had been working to try and draw the Romans into another fight. The Romans had their eyes on Saticola though, and refused to give battle. At some point, the Romans mounted another assault on the city. At the same time, the Samnites sprung forward and assaulted the rear of the Roman camp. Quintus Aulus Serentanus, the master of the horse, had been left in charge of the camp, while Quintus, seriously too many guys named that by the way, Fabius led the charge on the city. Serentanus led a countercharge with all of the Roman cavalry still in the camp. This was probably a fairly large force, as cavalry typically don't do a whole lot during a siege. The charge was so fierce and sudden that it caught the Samnites off guard, and actually allowed Serentanus to kill the Samnite commander. This infuriated the Samnites, who apparently fired volley after volley of missiles at the charging Roman cavalry. At some point during the chaos, the Samnite commander's brother had the opportunity to avenge his brother's death, and managed to kill Serentanus, literally ripping him off his horse. The Samnites surged forward in an attempt to retrieve both the body of Serentanus and their fallen leader. The Romans, though, were not going to allow that to happen. As one, the cavalry dismounted and formed a circle around the bodies. As the Romans in the center picked the bodies up and began to carry them back to camp, the Romans at the front fought the Samnite infantry to a standstill. The Romans were able to retreat back to their camp, while the now leaderless Samnites were forced to do the same. Later that day, the Samnites retreated, and only a few days later, the Romans captured Saticola. The theater of war then moved to the town of Sora. Sora was a Volscian town that had recently, probably in 345 or so, been subject to a fairly strong colonization effort by the Romans. Because of this, the town's majority inhabitants, who were Volscians, had received the Samnite offer to come over to the Samnite side with open arms. They revolted, and many of the Roman colonists were either killed or exiled. We are told that shortly after that, a battle occurred as the Roman army marched towards Sora near a place called Latulae. We are given two different accounts of this battle by Livy. Livy's preferred account tells of a battle in permanent stalemate, with it only ending in an undetermined fashion with the coming of night. At that point, the two armies both decided to leave and seek better positions to continue on with the war. However, Livy does mention an alternate account, whereby the Samnites absolutely crushed the Romans. Here, Livy tells us that the Romans had come to this battle with most of their new and raw recruits, while the Samnite army was made up of some of the most experienced and well-trained forces they had. As you can imagine, this was an absolute slaughter, and the Romans were no match for the Samnites. In fact, we are actually told by Livy that in this account, Quintus Fabius, the master of the horse, died in this battle, instead of the one back at Saticola. This battle would further split the Roman state into two, with the northern half being Roman citizens and loyal to the Roman cause, and the southern half being mostly allied towns, who were open to Samnite overtures. I will say here that I personally believe in the second account, as it would explain why quite a few Volscian, Auruntian, and Campanian allies of Rome were seemingly more hesitant to help, and even rebellious in the years to come. It would make sense that Rome suffered some sort of defeat, and that defeat pushed those allied towns to question their allegiances. In any case, Rome quickly recovered. In 314 BCE, the new consuls, Marcus Potellus and Gaius Sulpicius, led more troops to Sora. The town would have been very difficult to take, had it not been for some men willing to betray their city. It's hard to tell who exactly these men were, but many historians speculate that they were actually Roman colonists who had been skipped over or simply missed in the initial culling, and were thus eager to put Rome back in charge. These deserters told the Romans to move their camp back a few miles from the city. This would lull the men inside of Sora into a false sense of security, and the defenses would be lacking. After this, he led a group of roughly 10 men through a steep and difficult path into the main citadel of the city. At this point, he placed the men in strategic and visible areas of the citadel, all in the hopes of proving that the Romans had managed to capture the area. He then ran through the streets, shouting that the Romans had infiltrated the city and taken the citadel, and were preparing to assault the residential areas. This, of course, caused a massive amount of panic, especially after it was confirmed that there were Roman soldiers visible at the citadel. The citizens of Sora were now in complete panic mode, and common sense made its way out of their minds. They opened the city's main gate and fled through it. This was exactly what the Romans had been told to plan for. As soon as the gate was opened, a few Roman cohorts charged through and quickly overran the remaining garrison, and with that, captured the town. The leading men of Sora were executed, and a large Roman garrison was set up to control the town. After this, Rome turned its attention towards more of the rebellious towns. The towns of Asuna, Minturnae, and Vessi, all Asuni towns, had rebelled against Rome following the Battle of Latune. We aren't given much detail, but we are told that in a manner similar to that of Sora, all three cities were captured by the Romans. Apparently though, the consuls were not present at the time of their capture, and because of that, the Roman troops had free rein to slaughter as they pleased. Livy tells us that, quote, because the leaders were not present when the attack was made, there was no limit to the slaughter, and the Asuni nation was wiped out, end quote. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds a bit like genocide to me. After this, the two consuls succeeded in pushing deeper into Samnium proper, and apparently even managed to lay siege to Bavinium, the capital of the Pentri, the largest Samnite tribe, and the de facto capital of the Samnite state. The siege ended inconclusively following the winter months, as Rome turned their attention to the towns of Fragile and Potelius, two towns that the Samnites had just managed to take. The army was taken over by Gaius Potelius Libovolsus, a new dictator, and he managed to retake the two cities. We are told that around the same time, the Romans burned the city of Nola, and a massive number of colonists were sent to formerly Volscian areas in the hope of ensuring future loyalty. These included the island of Ponte, the Volscian town of Intermara Susana, and at Susia Arsuna. But this is where we will stop for today. The Romans and the Samnites have been trading blows for about 3 years now, and once again the war entered into a bit of a stalemate. Towns had been conquered, but then simply regained, and truly not much had changed. Yes, Rome managed to make it to Bavinium, but when your army is forced to leave that siege to retake two important towns, can you really call that a victory? So, yes, for now the two sides were at a standstill, and it seemed as though the war was winding down. However, something was about to change that, something big. It's time for our old friends the Etruscans to enter the fray. Join me next time as we see the rest of Italy begin to unite against Rome. The Second Samnite War had mostly devolved into a stalemate. The Samnites and the Romans both knew this. Neither could quite get the best of the other. If the Samnites took a town in Campania or convinced a town in Latium to come over to their side, then the Romans retook that town, or conquered one in Samnium, and vice versa. Those in charge in Rome and in Samnium were beginning to realize that this war had run its course, and that peace was the next step. However, before the two sides could really begin to iron out a peace treaty, a new rumor began to circulate in Italy. A rumor that had a chance to completely upend the war, and maybe even upend Rome's history. What was this rumor? How could it possibly relate to Rome and its war, and what effects did it have on the Second Samnite War? Let's talk about it. So we pick back up in about 312 or 311 BCE. As already stated, the war was beginning to slow down, and it seemed as though peace negotiations could begin at any moment. However, one of Rome's greatest enemies, the Etruscans, began to mobilize, seemingly for war against Rome. This was a cause of great concern for Rome, and a potential godsend for the Samnites. But we are getting a bit ahead of ourselves. What exactly had the Etruscans been up to in the past few centuries? Well, truthfully, they were in a state of slow decline. The Etruscans had been sandwiched between two powers that were easily their equals, or perhaps even greater than combined Etruscan power. The Romans had been an issue for the entirety of Etruria really since the founding of the Republic, and as Rome expanded south, the Etruscans found themselves struggling more and more to push back Rome's growing influence along their border. At the same time, the Etruscans were bordered to the north by the new Italian Celts, who had arrived sometime around 390 BCE. These Celts had been looking for new land to settle, and it just so happened that the Etruscans held some pretty decent land. This meant that the Etruscans and the Celts, outside of a few instances of allying to fight Rome, had quickly become enemies. Add to this the general decline that the Etruscans had experienced since their peak in power in the 5th century BCE, and you get a culture and a people in decline. However, decline does not mean irrelevance. Etruria was still a massive population center in Italy. It is very, and I mean very, difficult for historians and archaeologists to estimate the population of the Roman Republic at the time, as well as the population of the various Etruscan cities, but we know that the Roman Republic was concerned about the Etruscan threat, and we know that Livy and Diodorus both comment on how even in their declined state, the Etruscans still had quite the population. This really makes a lot of sense. Etruria is a very fertile region. While the Po Valley reigns supreme as the most fertile region of Italy, an honor it has held for frankly a very long time, Etruria, modern-day Tuscany, is certainly the most fertile region of central Italy, and has long been a population center. It should be no surprise then that the threat of Etruscan invasion was still a very serious matter for the Romans, especially if they allied with the Samnites. One consul, maybe Marcus Valerius Corvus, but we aren't totally sure, stayed in Samnium to keep the Samnites occupied, while another army, which was supposed to be led by the other consul, Publius Decius Mus, was sent to the border of Etruria to begin preparing for the war. Publius Decius Mus, though, was apparently sick enough that the Senate recommended appointing a dictator, and so Gaius Sulpicius Longus was appointed dictator and given command of the Second Roman Army. We know that Gaius's army was in no way aggressive, and was seemingly content to wait for the Etruscans to make the first move. In the meantime, Gaius simply drilled the new recruits, and by the end of the year it seems as though the army was at least decently trained. In 312, new consuls were elected. They were Gaius Junius Babulcus and Quintus Aemilius Barbula. Both consuls agreed to continue with the division of the Roman forces. Gaius Junius went to Samnium, while Quintus Aemilius went to the Etruscan border. The action for the year started in Samnium, at a town known as Culvia. We have no idea where this town was, but we do know that it was originally a Samnite town that had been conquered or occupied at some point during this war. The Romans had left a garrison in the city, and that garrison came under assault by the full might of a Samnite army. The Samnites were apparently content to starve the garrison out, and after they succeeded in such a move, Livy tells us that they slaughtered the entire Roman garrison, and were, quote, cruelly mangled by the Samnites. We don't know what exactly this means, but it apparently infuriated Gaius Junius, and he quickly marched to the town. Livy tells us that on the same day he arrived, he took the city, and then put every adult male, it's unclear if this was just military men, or if the town's civilian population was included, to death. Talk about revenge. Gaius, though, did not take much time to celebrate. He marched his army to Bivinium, capital of the Pentri tribe of Samnites, and one of, if not the most important city of the Samnites. Here he besieged the town. the second time the Romans had done such a thing. This time, though, the Romans succeeded in taking the town and sacked the city. Livy makes a point here to explain that the Romans were much gentler with the population of Bovinium, an eye for an eye and all that. It seemed that Rome was finally managing to get the upper hand on the Samnites. But looks can be deceiving, and the Samnites were not done just yet. The Samnites, seemingly wanting to try and recreate something similar to what happened at the Caudine Forks, put together a scheme. Encamping far enough away from the Romans to not be noticed, the Samnites sent a few soldiers into the Roman camp. These soldiers posed as deserters of the Samnite army and were taken prisoner, and eventually brought before the Roman consul and his commanders to give up information on Samnite troop movement and information about food supplies in the region. I should note here that we have basically no idea where exactly this was happening. We assume it was likely somewhere near Bovinium, but it could have just as easily been anywhere else in Samnium. In any case, the deserters told the Romans of a herd of cattle that had been driven into the nearby forest when the Romans approached. This was a fairly common occurrence during war, and was typically done to try and prevent that easily available source of food from falling into the enemy hands. The consuls were persuaded to send a detachment of troops into the forest to try and secure the herd. We don't know how large this detachment was, but Livy specifically notes that the consuls sent, quote, legions into the forest. So we can assume it was a fairly large portion of the army. This assortment of Roman troops were very lightly armored and carried only the bare essentials for this mission. It really makes a lot of sense when you think about it, as they assumed they were about to go trekking in dense forests. Any extra equipment would only bog them down. However, just as the Romans were about to enter the forest, a chorus of shouts rang out from either side of the path. You see, this was all a ruse. There were no cattle. Instead, the Samnites had set up their own army inside the forest, and had waited for the Romans to show up. The sudden attack was quite effective at first, and chaos reigned. However, the Romans quickly began to recover their wits. They formed into their battle lines, and despite not being fully equipped, were able to stem the bleeding and hold their positions. The consul himself rode to the front lines, and leapt from his horse. He called upon Jupiter, Mars, and any other god who would listen, and declared that he had not marched to war for personal glory. Instead, he had come to war with the goal of glory for Rome, and plunder for his troops. He admitted to being too anxious and too hasty, and that had led his men into his ambush. He turned to his men, and reminded them that they had defeated the Samnites in their cities and on the fields, in Sora and Frigile. In fact, their victories had been so impressive and so absolute that the Samnites were now forced to turn to underhanded tactics to try and defeat them. But what ground was too difficult for Roman courage? What enemy was too strong for Rome? No one and nowhere. The Romans were worked up into a frenzy and fought like men possessed. The Romans pushed forward and secured a position on top of a hill overlooking the bulk of the Samnite army. The Romans on the hill charged into the Samnites and quickly began to overwhelm them. Panicked, the Samnites attempted to retreat back into the forest, but found it now to be an obstacle rather than a hideaway. They couldn't get through the layers of deep undergrowth quick enough, and the Romans slaughtered them as they tried to flee. Livy tells us that very few escaped, and even states that afterwards the Romans searched the forest for the cattle. An interesting choice, Livy seems to say that they actually did find some cattle, which really just adds insult to injury for the Samnites. At the same time these events were happening in Samnium, the Etruscans finally sprung their attack. Livy tells us that the whole of Etruria, minus the city of Arretium, invaded Rome. This is pretty hard to believe, as, quite frankly, the Etruscans almost never did anything altogether. But we can assume that a sizable coalition of Etruscan cities allied together to attempt to fight the Roman menace. Arretium, the one named city to not join the war against Rome, was not quite allied with Rome, but wasn't quite an enemy either. It was a complicated relationship, and would actually eventually be a gateway for Rome to further its influence in Etruria, but that's a story for another time. The Etruscans marched to the city of Sertorium, modern-day Sirtri. The city was a key city on the Via Cassia, the road that led from Rome into Etruria. Because of its location on a main road, it was a pretty rich city, and it served, at least at this point, as quite possibly the main city of Rome in Etruria. The Etruscans laid siege to the city, and Quintus Aemilius knew he had to lift that siege or face being boxed out of Etruria. The two sides camped near each other, and the first day was spent by both sides discussing what exactly to do. Eventually, the Etruscans decided to quickly engage the Romans, and on the dawn of the second day, the signal for battle was given. The Etruscans lined up for battle about halfway between the two camps. The Romans lined up shortly thereafterwards, and the two armies set. They actually sat there for half the day. Livy tells us that it was past noon before the first missile was even fired by either of the armies. A pretty impressive feat considering that the Etruscans marched at first light. The Etruscans were the first to charge. The two sides met quickly. The Etruscans apparently held a slight numerical advantage, but the two sides were equally matched, and neither could gain the upper hand. The stalemate collapsed when Rome cycled their lines. Now Rome had put forward a new front line, filled with fresh, or well, I guess as fresh as you can be after sitting in the hot sun all day, Romans. The Etruscans apparently had no such preparations in place, and their front line collapsed under the onslaught of these fresh Roman troops. Luckily though, at least for the Etruscans, all that waiting in the sun did some good, as night fell before the Romans could really pursue the retreating army. Both sides returned to their camps. Apparently though, this battle had done quite the number on both armies, and no fighting was recorded for the rest of the year. The next year, 310 BCE, saw the election of Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus and Gaius Marcius Rutulus as consuls. Quintus Fabius was easily the more experienced of the pair, and was thus sent to Etruria, where it seemed that the main fighting was destined to occur. He brought with him more supplies and reinforcements. The Etruscans, though, had done much the same, and their armies were just as well supplied and reinforced. The two forces came face to face on the slopes of the mountains of Etruria, on either side of a wide open plain, both sides readied for battle. The Etruscans again held the upper hand in terms of raw numbers, and were apparently so confident in their numerical superiority that they again chose to charge first. This time though, the Etruscans abandoned their javelins, and eagerly charged forward to engage in hand-to-hand combat. This proved to be a massive mistake. The Romans launched a few waves of javelins at the charging mass of Etruscans before beginning to pick up the stones that littered the ground. Apparently the area was covered in these stones, and the Romans were able to pelt the Etruscans. These stones, while not quite deadly, were great at slowing the charge down, and confusing those unlucky enough to be hit in the head. If you've ever been hit in the head with a rock, I'm sure you understand, it's not a very fun experience. This confusion, along with the fact they were literally being pelted with rocks, caused the Etruscans to slow, and the line began to waver. The Romans took advantage of this opportunity, and conducted their own charge. The Etruscans apparently turned and fled rather than fight. The Roman cavalry chased the retreating Etruscans into the Samnian forest, a feared woodland that separated Latium and Etruria. At this point in history, the forest was almost totally impassable, and the Romans were extremely hesitant to chase the Etruscans into it. There are a few different accounts of what comes next. Some say that the consul's brother, Marcus Fabius, spoke Etruscan and led an expedition of Romans to explore the forest and the surrounding area. This expedition then ravaged the local area and eventually provoked the Etruscans into another battle where the Romans decisively won. Following this, the Etruscan cities of Perusia, Cortona, and Arretium made peace with Rome. A quick note here, I'm still confused as to why Arretium is in this list, as Livy specifically mentions that they did not declare war on Rome, but then also says here that they made peace with Rome. It's a little confusing, but make of it what you will. Other accounts simply state that the Romans ravaged the area around the forest enough to draw out the survivors. They fought another battle, Rome won, and the same cities made peace. Either way, Perusia, Cortona, and Arretium, the three leading cities of Etruria, made peace with Rome during this year. Livy doesn't really tell us what this treaty entailed, but he does say it included a 30-year truce. I'm sure that won't get broken or anything. I think this does speak to Rome's growing power. Whatever the real story here is, it can't be denied that Rome had just split their army in two and managed to defeat the Etruscans while holding the Samnites to a stalemate, or even winning. Speaking of the Samnites, at the same time this was all going on in Etruria, the fighting in Samnium still raged on. Gaius Marcius Rutulus captured the town of Aliphae, along with several other smaller towns and villages. It seemed, though, the Samnites were hesitant to engage the Romans in a pitched battle. The news of the Samnian forest situation apparently emboldened the Samnites, though. They received information that the Roman army was hemmed in, and that a repeat of the Claudine Forks was on the cards. We don't know if this was simply an intelligence failure, or just false information, or even a purposeful operation by the Romans. But whatever the case is, the Samnites quickly decided they needed to fight and wipe out the Roman troops under Gaius Marcius so as to not allow the Etruscans to steal all the glory of ending such a long war. The two armies met somewhere in Campania or Samnium. We have no details of this battle. We are only told that the final result was inconclusive and that both sides had lost quite a few men. It was unclear, even at the time, which side suffered the most. The consul himself, though, had been wounded, and reports of the situation quickly reached Rome. The Senate panicked, and in their panic determined that a dictator must be appointed. There was really only one choice, Lucius Papyrus Cursor. The issue at hand, though, was that the remaining consul, Quintus Fabius, was on bad terms with Lucius. We don't really know what happened here, but it was a well-known fact in Rome that neither of the two men could stand each other. This was an issue, as it was the consul, or typically the consuls, that had to nominate the dictator. The Senate sent a delegation of leading men and former consuls to Fabius to persuade him. The consul took the Senate resolution in silence and sent the delegation away, leaving the city in limbo as they questioned how the consul would respond. Fabius, though, was a man of his country first and foremost. He understood that Lucius Papyrus was the best man for the job, despite his personal dislike of the man. And so, he went before the Senate and nominated Lucius for the role of dictator. When the Senate thanked him for his cooperation and nomination, Fabius remained silent and simply left without a word. Lucius relieved the injured consul only a few days later. He combined this army with the army that had been serving under Fabius, and he marched towards Samnite territory. In 309 BCE, Lucius received his fight. Once again, we are sadly in the dark for this battle. We know that there was a bit of a competition between Lucius and his master of the horse, as each man led opposite wings of the army, and we know that the Romans won, and because of this victory, Lucius received a triumph. But that's really about it. We have no idea where it occurred, nor how close the battle was. We basically know nothing. We do know that shortly after this battle, a few of the Etruscan cities broke the treaty. Big shock. Quintus Fabius led a Roman army that apparently easily defeated the Etruscan army at Perusia, and the Etruscans were forced to accept Roman garrisons in some of their cities. Fabius also received a triumph, and was even re-elected consul in 308 BCE. After this point, the war essentially becomes a campaign of mopping up the last of the Samnite and allied resistance. Most of the final battles occur in Apula and Samnium, but the battles were one-sided, and Rome dominated. We don't have many details about these battles either. The Samnites had been spent, and by 304, the Romans had finally won the Second Samnite War. We don't really know what the treaty at the end of the war looked like. Livy only tells us that the, quote, old treaty was restored. It's hard to know what exactly this refers to. The treaty before the First Samnite War, the treaty afterwards, we don't really know. We can imagine that the treaty must have been favorable for the Romans. After all, they had outlasted the Samnites, and it was the Samnites that came to Rome looking for peace, not the other way around. We do know, though, that this war essentially ended Samnite influence in Campania, and seemingly even the border regions of Campania and Samnite proper. The Romans are able to fully integrate the Herensini and the Aqui, two tribes that had previously been in a quasi-independent state as a sort of buffer zone between Roman and Samnite influence. Several Volscian, Sabines, and Latin towns in southern Latium were officially made Roman citizens and cities. This, of course, expanded the true Roman state. Naples, Marsi, Marunci, Paleongini, Frientini, and Vestini, all cities and peoples surrounding Samnium, were made official Roman allies. They agreed to support the Roman military at their own expense, and in exchange were given access to Roman spoils of war and protected by the Roman military. The Romans had essentially kicked the Samnites out of Campania, Latium, and Umbria. However, the Etruscans and the Umbrians were not yet pacified, so it's hard to say that Rome had established dominance over central Italy. Instead, the Second Samnite War accelerated Rome's path to dominance. It allowed Rome to fill the vacuum of Samnite influence in the region, and that new influence would give Rome an edge over its other rivals. This isn't to say that Rome wasn't the most powerful state in Italy at this point. It was. But Rome was still vulnerable to an alliance of Italian states. If the Etruscans and the Umbrians, for instance, decided to ally together, then Rome would certainly struggle to overcome something like that. But mano a mano, Rome had by this point become the most powerful Italian state. Think of it something like this. The war had not given Rome free reign in central Italy, but what it had done was allow Rome to start on the path of Italian domination, in the same way that the first series of wars against Etruscan cities were a test for Rome as a local power. This was Rome's first test as a regional Italian power. While they had not 2v1 Etruria and Samnium from the beginning, they had managed a solid 4 to 5 years of war against both. And it wasn't like Rome seriously struggled with either during this time. They were able to split their armies in two, and kept the enemies separated long enough to pick them off one by one. A feat like that points to a changing power base in the Italian peninsula. This was a turning point in Roman history, even if the Romans themselves did not quite know it. The year is 299 BCE, and Rome has been establishing itself as the dominant power in Italy for several decades. At this point, Rome was likely strong enough to fight wars in Italy on two fronts, something that was about to be tested. In the north, the Etruscans schemed with the Gauls to try and inflict a devastating defeat on the Romans, while in the south, the Samnites attempted to assert themselves once again following their disastrous defeat at the hands of the Romans just under a decade ago. What will Rome do? Will the Etruscans be successful? And why do the Samnites keep trying to push their luck with Rome? Let's talk about it. We start then in the north. In the north, the Etruscans were not exactly in decline, but they were certainly not ascendant, as they had been in past centuries. Remember, Rome had conquered the city of Veii in 396 BCE, and ever since then it had become fairly clear just who was winning the eternal war between the Etruscans and the Romans. We aren't totally sure what sparked this most recent conflict, but we are pretty sure it was the new colony that Rome had set up in Narnia, modern-day Narni. The Latin name is much cooler, by the way. This new colony, while not in Etruria, was close enough that the Etruscans took issue with it. The Gauls invaded right around the same time. Talk about a 1-2 punch. The Etruscans thought, why not kill two birds with one stone? Let's just pay the Gauls to fight the Romans. Everyone hates the Romans, right? And to a certain extent, they were probably right. The Romans were the up-and-coming threat in Italy, and most everyone, save for their allies of course, were at least a little bit wary of them. The Gauls agreed, but apparently after receiving their payment, made a big fuss about fighting the Romans, and claimed the agreement was really only for them not to pillage Etruscan land, which was not what the agreement was about, but anyway. The Etruscans just said whatever, and the Gauls left with their payment in hand and war averted. This would actually drive another group, the Pients, to ally with Rome. They lived along the Adriatic coast in Umbria, and were concerned that the newly paid off Gauls would now come for their land instead of Etruria. We'll come back to them in a moment though. At this point, the Etruscans had broadcasted their intent pretty openly, and Rome put together a force under Titus Manilius Torquatus, one of the consuls for the year and from the famous Manili family. Livy tells us that on his way to Etruria, he was thrown from his horse during a training exercise and died 3 days later. Pretty terrible way to go if you ask me. The Etruscans saw this as a favorable omen for war, and for a time it seemed that they would give open battle to the Romans. The Senate acted quickly though, and elected Marcus Valerius Corvus Calenus as suffect consul, basically a consul to replace the dead consul, and sent him with all haste to Etruria. He arrived, and we are told that his arrival scared the Etruscans, and they refused to give battle. They remained behind their fortifications even as Valerius devastated their countryside. So the war in the north was going pretty well for Rome, but what was happening in the south? Well, the Pients, the group that had just allied with Rome, were insisting that the Samnites were looking for someone to attack. Apparently they had been approached for an alliance and for help in this upcoming war, but they had refused, and word was sent to Rome about this gathering force. As you can imagine, this fairly quickly diverted attention from the north, likely a godsend for the Etruscans to be frank, and most of the Roman forces turned their attention south. They didn't have to wait long, as just a few months later, the Lucanians, a fairly large tribe living in, you guessed it, Lucania, a region to the immediate south of Samnite territory, sent a delegation asking for Roman protection. Apparently, the Lucanians had been approached and offered the same deal, but unfortunately for them, they didn't have Roman protection, and so when they refused, the Samnites declared an all-out war. Rome agreed to protect the Lucanians, and sent Fetiles to Samnium to order the Samnites to leave Lucania. Livy tells us that the Fetiles were threatened, and that Rome then declared war, but Dionysius of Halicarnassus has a different story. He claims that Rome did not send Fetiles at all, and instead simply claimed alliance with the Lucanians as soon as the war kicked off, for fear of the possible power that the Samnites could gain from conquering Lucania. Personally, I think the story is probably somewhere in the middle. I imagine that the Lucanians realized they couldn't beat the Samnites mano a mano, and so sent out envoys to most of the other powers in the area asking for help. Rome probably saw the opportunity and jumped at it, as they frankly so often did. The two consuls for the year, Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus and Gnaeus Fulvius Maximus Centramalis, were thus charged with carrying out a war in both the north and the south. Lucius was assigned Etruria, and Gnaeus was assigned the Samnites. Barbatus engaged the Samnites somewhere near Volterrae, a city in the north of Etruria. The Etruscans gave battle, and the battle was seemingly inconclusive, with both sides losing many men. Eventually, though, night fell, and both sides were forced to retreat. Apparently, the Etruscans believed they would be the losing side, as under the cover of night they retreated. Barbatus pushed this advantage, and moved to Phocian territory. This group of Italic peoples lived north of the Tiber in Latium, but they supported the Etruscans. The Phocian lands were then pillaged with impunity. Down south, we have a bit of a conflicting account. Livy tells us that Gnaeus easily won in Samnium, and went on to seize the towns of Bovinium and Aufindia. However, the sarcophagus of Lucius Barbatus claims that it was he who conquered Taresia and Sassania and Samnium, and that he went on to subdue all of Lucania. Even more mystery is added when we consult the Fasti Triumphalis, the record of Roman triumphs. In this record, Gaius Fulvius is claimed to have received a triumph against both the Samnites and the Etruscans. So, what gives? Who fought in Samnium and who fought in Etruria? Well, there is no clear answer. If we believe Livy, then Barbatus fought in Etruria, while Gaius Fulvius fought in Samnium. If we believe Barbatus' sarcophagus, then Barbatus fought in both. If we believe the Fasti Triumphalis, then Gaius Fulvius fought in both. We don't know who fought where, or who received what awards. Remember that this is still a period of Roman history where our primary sources are very, and I mean very, light. Our best source is Livy, who was writing some 300 years later, and because of that, we simply do not have enough information to know what set of statements is the truth. If you want my opinion, I would argue that it's fairly likely that both consuls engaged both enemies, with either one consul in full command and the other subordinate, or at the head of two different armies. Sadly though, this is something we do not have a clear answer to, and we probably never will. It's as the great Tim Cornell says, no satisfactory resolution to this puzzle is possible. What does seem clear though, is that the Romans first moved to Lucania before moving to Samnium proper. Livy tells us that the Romans received hostages in 298, the same year as the war started. These hostages were apparently sent to Rome in good faith, and as a sort of bonus for retaking Lucania. Again, this is a bit of a question mark. Why would Rome need hostages from an ally, especially one that currently had the Roman army present in its borders? Some historians have argued that Livy notes that Rome put down revolts in Lucania in 296 at the request of Lucanian aristocracy, and that maybe these hostages were from families of peoples less inclined towards Rome. This might also explain our question about the two consuls, as one or the other might have gone to Lucania to quell protest, not to fight the Samnites, but again, we will probably never know for sure. In 297 BCE, the Romans elected their consuls as rumors spread that the Etruscans and the Samnites were again raising large armies. Because of this, Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus, a man who had already defeated the Samnites, was again elected consul. At first, it seemed that he would actually refuse the position. He was pretty old at this point, and likely wished for retirement. But Livy tells us that he finally relented, on the condition that his old colleague, Publius Decius Mus, would be elected to serve alongside him. Livy is, again, our only source for the events of this year, but he tells us that several Roman colonies in southern Etruria sent word that, contrary to the rumors, the Etruscans were actually considering suing for peace. Apparently this was enough for the consuls to completely turn their attention to the Samnites, something that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would the Romans just assume that because a few of their colonies heard that maybe the Etruscans were considering suing for peace, that they should simply leave it to them and hope for the best? I think that Livy is missing something here, and that the Etruscans actually agreed to a peace, or maybe at least a ceasefire, at some point in 297, and that actually freed the consuls to turn their attention south. But I digress. So both Roman armies turned their attention south. Quintus Fabius led his army through the town of Sora, while Decius Mus led his army through the Sidicini district, which basically followed the Liri River. The first engagement would go to Fabius, in a valley near the town of Tifrania. The Samnites had set up in a nearby valley, with the hope of ambushing the Romans as they marched through. Luckily for the Romans, their scouts had managed to find the enemy, and so they avoided the ambush. Once the Samnites discovered that they had been caught, they faced a pretty serious dilemma. If they didn't give battle now, they risked the other Roman army reinforcing Fabius's army, and so greatly outnumbering their force, but if they did give battle, then they would be fighting on an even playing field against a commander who had already proven himself to be extremely formidable. It's a pretty tough choice. But the Samnites chose to fight. The fight was actually going pretty well for the Samnites, when suddenly a force of Romans appeared at their rear. This force, led by Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, funnily enough, had been sent by Fabius to circle around the Samnites while they were distracted by the main force. Fabius had told very few people in the army of this move, and so the vast majority of both sides were surprised at their arrival. The Roman morale soared, as they thought it was the army of Decius Mus, while the Samnites collapsed and fled, as they too assumed Decius Mus had caught up to them. Not all was good for Rome, however. Their casualties were bad enough that they didn't have the organization nor morale to give chase, and the Samnites had survived with enough men that once they regrouped, they would still be a decently effective fighting force. Truly, the detachment of Roman men didn't really win the battle, so much as they simply averted a possible disaster. After this battle, the two armies linked up in Samnium, and together posed such a threat that no Samnite forces would openly attack the two. This allowed the Romans free rein to pillage and burn the countryside, something they did with a zealous rage. Really, this year was more of a waiting period instead of the decisive year of war that the Romans wanted. As no triumphs were recorded for the year, we can be fairly certain that no large-scale engagements took place, or if they did, they didn't go well for the Romans. The following year, 296 BCE, Appius Claudius Caecus and Lucius Volumnius Flamma Violens were elected consuls, but both Decius Mus and Quintus Fabius were elected proconsuls and given an additional 6-month term to prosecute the war in Samnium. Probably a smart idea considering who we're talking about. Decius continued to ravage Samnium, even apparently forcing the Samnite army to leave Samnium altogether instead of engaging it. The Samnites journeyed to Etruria, where they hoped to form an alliance to finally defeat Rome. Here, the Samnites demanded the Etruscans gather their leaders for a council, something that the Etruscans often used to make decisions for the wider Etruscan world. Livy's quote about this council is pretty eye-opening, and I think it's really interesting, so I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing to you. Quote, "When it had assembled, they pointed out how for many years they had been fighting with the Romans, how they had tried in every possible way to sustain the weight of that war in their own strength, and how they had proved the assistance of their neighbors to be of small value. They had sued for peace because they could no longer endure war. They had taken to war again because a peace which reduced them to slavery was heavier to bear than a war in which they could fight as free men. The only hope left to them now lay in the Etruscans. They knew that they, of all the nations of Italy, were the richest in arms and men and money, and they had for their neighbors the Gauls, trained to arms from the cradle, naturally courageous to desperation, and, especially against the Romans, a nation whom they justly boast of having captured and then allowing them to ransom themselves with gold. If the Etruscans had the same spirit which Porcinia and their ancestors once had, there was no reason why they should not expel the Romans from the whole of their land, as far as the Tiber, and compel them to fight, not for their insupportable dominion over Italy, but for their very existence. The Samnite army had come to them completely, provided with arms and a war chest, and were ready to follow them at once, even if they led them to an attack on Rome itself." I'm sure Livy is paraphrasing a bit here, but damn, he does a good job at it. I'm almost ready to switch sides and burn Rome myself. Anyway, back in Samnium, Decius Mus had an epiphany. Why was he attacking the countryside and undefended towns when there was no army in the area? Why wasn't he attacking the large cities? Surely they were the most vulnerable right now, with no Samnite army to be found. Well, he was right, and that's what he did. Mus took the towns of Merguntia and Remilia, two decently sized Samnite cities, before marching towards the town of Fermentium in southern Etruria. Livy does point out here that his sources debate on who exactly took these towns. It could have been Mus, it could have been Quintus Fabius, or it even could have been Lucius Volumnius, the consul for the year. In the end, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that the cities were taken by a Roman force. Back in Etruria, things were going pretty well for the Samnites. So well that we actually get a name for the Samnite commander this time, Gellius Ignatius. No depictions or accounts of his depiction exist, sadly, but we are told that he was the leader of the Verani, a leading clan of the Samnites, and that he had been in charge of organizing the campaign against Rome. What campaign against Rome, I hear you asking? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, after the Council of Etruscans, nearly every Etruscan city had voted for war. This fervor apparently even spread to the neighboring Umbrian tribes, who not only joined in the effort, but began attempts to hire Gallic mercenaries as well. I really wasn't kidding when I said that at this point in history, Rome was beginning to be hated by nearly every other tribe in central Italy. News of this gathering force reached Rome fairly quickly, and Appius Claudius, the other consul for the year, set off to Etruria with 2 legions and apparently 15,000 allied troops. This would be added to the other 2 legions and 12,000 allied troops that Lucius Volumnus had already taken towards Etruria. This is the first time that Livy really mentions numbers for the war. If we are to believe his numbers, then Rome had raised 6 legions, with each legion being somewhere around 4,500 men at this point in history. That means that Rome would have marched to war with 4 full-strength legions, which totaled about 18,000 men, plus the remnants of 2 other legions under the proconsuls, which would have been about 9,000 men at peak strength, along with the 27,000 allied troops. That would have been somewhere between 45 and 54,000 men, a truly absurd number. Is it possible that Rome marched with this many men? Well, hypothetically, sure. Probable? Definitely not. Again, Livy is notorious for inflating numbers on both sides of wars he covers. I would imagine that Rome probably only marched with 4 legions, and probably somewhere around 10 to 15,000 allies, putting the number at around 28 to 33,000. Again, we will probably never know for sure, but just take those numbers with a pinch of salt. Now, as the army marched, apparently Appius Claudius proved himself to be a complete idiot, and as the army reached Etruria, they had completely lost confidence in him. This was not the case with his colleague, Lucius Volumnus, who had already taken a couple of fortifications and instructed Decius Mus and Quintus Fabius to pillage the Samnium countryside and suppress revolts in Lucretia, respectively. This supposedly eventually led to a meeting with both consuls, where they agreed to share command over a single large army. In reality, though, it's probably fairly safe to assume that Lucius Volumnus took over command from Appius Claudius to quell any discontent among the regular soldiers. Eventually, the 2 sides met for battle. Livy tells us that upon this meeting, the Samnite general in charge, Gellius Ignatius, had gone with a small detachment on a foraging expedition, something that was pretty common for the time. This meant that command was not concentrated in one man any longer. The Etruscans now commanded the Etruscans, the Samnites, and the Umbrians the Umbrians. I'm sure you can probably see where this is going. In the absence of credible leadership, the 3 armies just sort of did their own thing. The Etruscans charged Volumnus, probably along with the Umbrians, and the Samnites apparently refrained from charging, which was what Gellius had ordered. When Gellius returned, it was to discover his own men still in camp, while the Etruscans and the Umbrians were giving battle. Gellius rushed to engage Appius, who had just arrived in the field before he could fall upon his allies. The battle was over rather quickly. The 3 armies were simply too independent, and facing a united Roman force able to pivot and respond to battlefield positions with much more accuracy and speed. It was simply a rout. The Romans pushed all the way to the combined camp and plundered and captured all that they could. Livy tells us that over 6,900 men were killed and 2,120 made prisoners. This seemingly shattered the alliance, well, at least for now. Lucius Volumnus rushed to Samnium to take over the armies there, as the proconsulships of Quintus Fabius and Decius Mus were about to expire. Appius Claudius had apparently redeemed himself during the battle and was given command of the force still in Etruria. The few Samnites still present in Samnium, likely concentrated around the capital of Beneventum, managed to raise a small raiding army that made some incursions into Roman allies in Campania and Capua. At the same time, Lucius Volumnus managed to cut off some of the fleeing Samnite army from Etruria. Here, he pretty easily defeated them, and apparently stole some portion of their loot along with retrieving hundreds of Roman prisoners. The next year, 295 BCE, started off with a bang. The Samnite raids had generated a bit of panic back in Rome itself, and this was further fueled by new rumors that the Samnites and the Etruscans were regrouping, But this time, they were not only joined by the Umbrians, but also the previously mentioned Gallic mercenaries. The hoped-for coalition, at least on the Samnite side, was actually beginning to form. The Roman Senate acted quickly. They ordered all other business suspended and ordered that every able-bodied man, of all ages and classes, report for military service. The regular legions were made, but alongside them, cohorts of older men and even freed slaves were formed to serve as auxiliaries. These auxiliaries may very well have been made in order to defend the city, as Livy explicitly tells us that arrangements were made for the defense of Rome itself, but we simply lack the information to fully determine what they were used for. Quintus Fabius and Decius Mus, as the two greatest living Roman commanders, were again called upon to serve as consuls. The news wasn't all doom and gloom, however. Lucius Volumnus, the last year's consul, reported that he had managed to track down and destroy the army the Samnites had sent to raid Campania and Capua, and probably because of that fact, he was given a temporary proconsulship for the year. Notice how Appius Claudius didn't receive such a command. More proof that he had somehow really messed up when it came to his own command. It was decided that the two full consuls would march for Etruria, while Lucius Volumnus would march for Samnium. We are told that the two full consuls for the year marched with 4 fresh legions, a quote, large cavalry force, and 1,000 Campanian soldiers, along with an even larger allied army. Lucius Volumnus marched back to Samnium with 2 fresh legions of his own. It was extremely likely at this point that Roman manpower was either nearly completely tapped or close to it. This was likely the most men Rome had ever mustered, and they were going to need it. The general consensus is that Lucius Volumnus marched with such a large army in a bid to force the Samnites to respond to their raids in Samnium with the hope of limiting how many men they could spare for the war in Etruria. It's pretty debatable if this really worked, and in reality this was probably just a waste of troops. On the other side of the war, the Etruscans, Samnites, Umbrians, and Gauls crossed the Apennine Mountains near Centenium. The Romans met them there. The plan was for the Gauls and the Samnites to directly attack the Roman force. While that battle was ongoing, the Etruscans and the Umbrians were to flank around and take the Roman camp. With nowhere to retreat to, and sandwiched between the armies, the Romans would quickly be routed and the path to Rome would lay open. These plans, though, were leaked to Quintus Fabius by a few Gallic deserters, likely men who were paid off by Rome. Fabius immediately went into action. He ordered the praetors of Rome, who had been left in charge of the city's defenses, to take the reserve troops, likely those cohorts of older and freedmen, and raid the Etruscan countryside. The goal was to distract and keep the Etruscan attention with constant retreats. This worked, and the Etruscans and the Umbrians marched to the town of Centenium itself to defend their land. Remember that at this point the Etruscans thought that Rome was completely clueless and had no idea what the plan was. If the Etruscans played their cards right, not only would they defend their countryside, but they would also be in the position to actually flank the Roman army when the Samnites and Gauls gave battle. Sadly for them, though, that is not what happened. With the two armies gone, the Romans attacked the Gauls and the Samnites. Quintus Fabius took command of the right flank against the Samnites, while Decius Mus commanded the left against the Gauls. Fabius fought a defensive battle, while Mus fought much more aggressively. At first, Mus was quite successful, with 2 separate cavalry charges nearly breaking through the defending lines. On the second charge, though, the Roman cavalry even managed to nearly make contact with the Samnite infantry, something that would have spelt near certain defeat for the Samnites, but they were counterattacked by Gallic chariots before they could. The chariots proved to be too much to bear, and the Roman cavalry broke. This left the Roman infantry open for a charge, which the Gauls accordingly did. At first, the Romans completely broke, and for a time it looked like the entire left side of the Roman army would collapse. Decius Mus, seeing this, decided that a desperate action was needed. He gathered his most elite troops that he could find around him, and performed Diva Vito. For those who don't know what that is, it was one of the most extreme actions a Roman general could take. Essentially, they would vow to the gods that they would give their life in battle in exchange for victory. Decius' father, also named Publius Decius Mus, had done the same against the Latins back in 340 BCE, and now it was his son's turn. Decius Mus found Marcus Livius in the Chaos, who was a pontiff or Roman religious officer, and ordered him to remember his words to seal his oath. Quote, "Why do I any longer defer the fate entailed on my family?" Decius said. "It is the appointment of destiny to our race that we should serve as expiatory victims to avert the public danger. I will now offer the legions of the enemy, together with myself, a bloody sacrifice to earth and the infernal gods. Having thus said, he commanded Marcus Livius, a pontiff, whom, at his coming out to the field, he had charged not to stir from him, to dictate the form of words in which he was to devote himself, and the legions of the enemy, for the army of the Roman people, the Quirites. He was accordingly devoted, with the same imprecations, and in the same habitat in which his father, Publius Decius, had ordered himself to be devoted at the Viceres in the Latin War. After this, he added that, quote, he carried along with him dismay and flight, slaughter and blood, and the wrath of the gods celestial and infernal, that, with the contagious influence of the Furies, the ministers of death whose victim he would inflict the standards, the weapons, and the armor of the enemy, and on the same spot should be accomplished his perdition, and that of the Gauls and Samnites. End quote. After this, Decius Mus led a charge into the thickest part of the Gallic line, where he quickly met his death. Seeing their general charge to his death, rallied the Romans on the left flank, and they fought like men possessed. Marcus Livius, who had been assigned Decius's lictors and position by Decius himself, further rallied the men by shouting aloud, quote, the Romans were victorious, being exempted from misfortune by the death of their consul, that the Gauls and Samnites were now the victims of Mother Earth and the infernal gods. That Decius was summoning and dragging to himself the army devoted along with him, and that, among the enemy, all was full of dismay and the vengeance of the Furies. End quote. Quintus Fabius had also sent 2 reserved formations to reinforce the line, and both arrived shortly after this act. Back on the right, Quintus Fabius had been fighting at a much slower pace than his colleague, and still commanded much of the same strength he did prior to giving battle. Because of this, he was able to order a full cavalry charge into the Samnite lines, something that probably would not have been possible without the Gallic chariots and cavalry being engaged with the other flank of the Roman army. This broke the Samnite lines, and the Samnites apparently fled from the field. Fabius then turned his attention to the remaining Gauls. The Gauls fought valiantly, but Fabius had further ordered his cavalry to flank around to their rear, something they were now able to do with impunity as the Samnites had fled, and the Gauls were completely occupied with the other Roman force. Once the Gauls were sandwiched between cavalry to their rear and a furious and zealous Roman force to their front, the fight was quickly over. Livy tells us that the Gauls were nearly completely slaughtered, while Fabius continued forward with the rest of the army and took the Samnite camp, and thus the Romans won the day. A very uplifting story. But was any of it true? Well, I don't know for sure, but I will speculate just a little bit here. Certainly the events up to Decius's oath were likely true. It is at the oath that it gets a little bit murky. While I do not doubt that seeing one's commander heroically sacrifice themselves would lead to a resurgence in morale, we should keep in mind that battlefields were extremely chaotic places, even when neither army was fighting. When one army was fleeing and one was charging, it was basically like letting a bunch of rats high off cocaine run around your house. Who knows what they're getting up to? Because of this, I seriously doubt that Decius Mus had some extraordinarily heroic moment where the battle paused around him as he charged straight into the waiting swords of the Gauls. Instead, I would imagine that Decius Mus was killed in action, and that it was only when the reserve troops, sent by Fabius, arrived that order was restored to the Roman lines. It just seems a bit convenient that after all this glorious and heroic actions by Decius, reinforcements just so happened to arrive. I think it's much more likely that it was those reinforcements, not Decius's actions, that restored the left wing of the army to a fighting force. But what do you all think? Let me know down in the comments. Afterwards, Livy notes that the war was essentially decided. Lucius Volumnus destroyed another army back in Samnium, while the praetors managed to defeat the Etruscans. Quintus Fabius left Decius's army to guard Etruria, while he returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. Appius Claudius, probably because Rome didn't really have anyone else free, returned to Etruria to command Decius's army as pro-praetor. Quintus Fabius returned to Etruria to destroy any remaining resistance later in the year, while Appius and Lucius Volumnus united their forces and defeated the Samnites again near Capua. 294 was a bit of an intervening year. There were several engagements, but none that were decisive nor large enough to end the war. Rome managed to make peace with several Etruscan city-states, but that was really all that happened. It was really in 293 that the war began to wind down. The Samnites were able to regroup with an army around Aquilonia. One consul, Spurius Carvilius Maximus, led an army to take the town of Amaterium, while the other, Lucius Papirius Cursor, the son of Lucius Papirius from the Second Samnite War, led an army towards Daronia. The two armies then made to challenge the new Samnite force. Spurius went to Cominium, while Lucius Papirius besieged Aquilonia. Both consuls attacked at the same time, so as to ensure that one Samnite force could not reinforce the other. Lucius Papirius took Aquilonia, while Spurius took Cominium. At this point, the Samnites were nearly exhausted. These armies were the last of the men that they could raise, and even those men were essentially forced to swear religious oaths to fight the Romans on pain of death. Their defeat was really the end of serious Samnite resistance. Following this, the two consuls split up and began conquering Samnite towns. Now, we don't know where these towns and cities were, so I'm just going to flash them up in front of you and save you from having to listen to me try to pronounce them. Back in Etruria, the Etruscans tried once more to attack Rome. This time they were backed by the Volscians. They managed to at least draw with the Roman army, and since winter was setting in, the Romans retreated to Samnium. Lucius Papirius celebrated a triumph in Rome, and then returned to Campania to protect the area from any Samnite raids, while Spurius went to Etruria. Spurius managed to steamroll his way through the region, and the Volscians quickly sued for peace, which the Romans accepted. At this point, our main account for the war, Livy's, ends. The remaining books are lost or heavily fragmented, so we can really only look at scraps here. We are told that a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges was elected consul in 292, and managed to actually lose a battle in Samnium, and was only spared a recall and possible exile by the intervention of his father, who promised to help his son, read, take over command. This allowed the Romans to quickly defeat the Samnites, and the Samnite commander, Gaius Pontius, was captured and beheaded. The remaining details are extremely scant, but by the end of 290 BCE, the Samnites had been utterly defeated, and the Romans moved forward with a plan to colonize their land. At this point, Rome now had unfettered control over Central and exerted influence in the rest of Italy. The Samnites were made quote-unquote allies, but were really subjugated into a sort of vassal kingdom. Other groups in central Italy were also conquered around the same time, including the Sabines, who lived in mountains east of Rome, the Praetulti, who lived east of those Sabines, along with the beginning of the integration of the Lucretians as an allied kingdom. At this point, Rome had truly begun to lay the groundwork that would allow them to expand beyond the Italian peninsula. These subjugated peoples were all treaty bound to provide soldiers for Rome's armies, something that would greatly increase the amount of men Rome could field, but more on that later. For the Samnites, this marked the end of any real resistance to Rome. They had been fully taxed by the war, and their fighting age population had been decimated. Even if they wanted to try and fight Rome, they would have to wait for at least another generation. They would never really get the opportunity because, as you likely know, Rome was just getting started. Join me next time as Rome continues their meteoric rise. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. As regular viewers could probably tell, this was a few older videos edited together on the Samnite Wars. You all seemed to enjoy this when I did it for the Roman King series, so I thought I would try it again. Let me know what you think down below. I also want to take a moment to thank you all for the recent support. It's been really insane watching my channel grow, and I really appreciate each and every one of you. It means the world to me. If you have any comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.